At the height of the Cold War, the countries involved were spending exorbitant amounts of money on defense. For West Germany, this figure was roughly 3% of its gross domestic product, or GDP. The UK more than doubled this figure with 6.3%. However, this was nowhere near the US's spending, which averaged about 8.6% of the country's GDP. Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, was a clear frontrunner with its military expenditure reaching a staggering 15% of its GDP by some estimates. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Cold War drew to a close. This ushered in the era of the so-called peace dividend, when countries were finally able to reduce their military spending. The iron grip of fear loosened, and a new dawn of opportunity and growth emerged. But fast forward to the 2020s, and it seems that it's getting dark once again. As the post-Cold War peace dividend hangs by a thread, countries are ramping up their defense budgets once again, while their government officials are warning the citizens to brace for war. An all-out war in Europe. On one side, Russia, and the other, NATO. Ever since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, these two opposing parties have been engaged in a high-stakes geopolitical chess game, with those stakes growing higher by the day. The situation seemingly reached an all-time high 2 years later when French President Emmanuel Macron opened the door to European nations sending troops to Ukraine in February 2024, reaffirming this possibility some 3 months later. If you're unsure as to why this is such a big deal, all you need to know is that Ukraine isn't a NATO member state, so the alliance is only allowed to send aid and not any combat troops. With Russia's President Vladimir Putin responding to Macron's bold statement and the possibility of a NATO-Russia conflict with an ambiguous "everything is possible in the modern world," all that is left to do is to ask a simple question: when will an all-out war between Russia and NATO break out? We don't have to go far to get an answer to this question. What's more, we don't even have to speculate or estimate. Top NATO military officials have come out and stated exactly when this war is expected to happen. By 2044. That makes for potentially 20 years of tensions, brinkmanship, and the ever-present threat of conflict. But to make matters worse, the prediction was made in January 2024 at a meeting of NATO's Military Committee in Brussels. That was before Macron's statement further chipped away at an already fragile relationship between Russia and NATO. Now this clash seems much more imminent, with Russia warning that it would be nothing but a stepping stone to World War III. This frightening possibility has forced all NATO member countries to reconsider their assessments and plans for the future. Just a few months back, in December 2023, German Minister of Defense Boris Pistorius warned that his country only had 5 to 8 years to prepare for the next major conflict. Though judging how things are currently unfolding, this could turn into as little as 5 to 8 months. But how did we get here? Is Macron's statement the only reason why a NATO-Russia clash seems both inevitable and imminent? Absolutely not. Far from it, actually. Let's discuss all the chess piece moves that have brought us to this checkmate position where the slightest misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences. Move number 1. After fighting fiercely for nearly 2 years, Ukraine seems to be on the brink of defeat. And Ukraine's loss can only mean one thing: a domino effect of chaos and conflict. NATO will lose face and Putin will feel more emboldened than ever. With this new dynamic, the whole of Europe will be at Russia's mercy. But let us pose the same question once again. How did we get here? Wasn't Ukraine giving a masterclass in defending your country against a much more powerful enemy with seemingly endless resources? Well, that's just it. There's only so much you can do with asymmetrical warfare and sheer determination. Beyond that, you need those resources, especially when the invading side keeps pouring more and more into the conflict with every passing day. So where are these much-needed resources for Ukraine? Buried under red tape and stuck in a political game of finger-pointing and bickering, that's where. The first part mostly refers to the US, which has been the #1 aid donor to Ukraine since the invasion started. However, the last aid package from the country was delayed for roughly 6 months due to a strong Republican opposition. For Ukraine, these 6 months felt like 6 years. The city of Avdiivka fell under Russian control, taking an estimated 7,000 Ukrainian lives with it. This loss reverberated far beyond the city's borders, signaling that Russia might be turning the tide in the conflict. Luckily, the $61 billion aid package was finally approved in April 2024. The very existence of the Ukrainian nation hinged on a vote taking place in the U.S. House of Representatives some 5,000 miles away. This new package is likely to include air defense systems, mid- and long-range missiles, and artillery shells, all things Ukraine has been desperately pleading for in the last few months. This should be enough to help the country challenge Russia's air superiority and slow its troops, who've recently captured hundreds of square miles of Ukraine's territory. The overwhelming sentiment in Ukraine is better late than never. However, some experts can't help but wonder, has the aid arrived too late? But wait a second, the US might be the biggest donor, but it certainly isn't the only one. What about the European states that have also supported Ukraine bravely and consistently? What about Germany, France, the UK? Well, remember the finger-pointing and bickering we just mentioned a few minutes back? These countries are the main actors in those silly yet tense discussions. So, what's the issue? The issue lies in the amount of aid promised and delivered by each of these NATO countries. The consensus seems to be that France isn't doing enough. These accusations started being thrown around after the German think tank, the Kiel Institute, published the Ukraine Support Tracker, totaling all the military, financial, and humanitarian aid sent to Ukraine. According to the Kiel Institute, in a little more than 2 years, the US alone donated $72 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. The European countries together donated almost $100 billion, but the trouble lies in the breakdown of those European countries. Germany tops the list with $11 billion in military aid, $3 billion in humanitarian aid, and $1.5 billion in financial aid. Next, we have the UK, which sent $5.7 billion in military aid, $600 million in humanitarian aid, and $3.5 billion in financial aid. Then, we go one place down the list, and another, and one more, and then two more, and yup, there's France. So far, France has helped Ukraine with almost $3 billion in military aid, $400 million in humanitarian aid, and $870 million in financial aid. Given that France has the third largest economy in Europe and the first two economies are Germany and the UK, France's contribution to Ukraine was seen as modest at best. But the biggest issue wasn't the amount of aid itself, it was the all-grand promises and awe-inspiring declarations made by the French president, only for them to be followed up with almost no action. That's why the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz ordered European officials to compose lists of the planned weapons shipments to Ukraine in January 2024. This move was seen as an attempt to put pressure on countries that have been underperforming in the aid department. Scholz criticized these contributions for being too small and urged the European allies to step up their efforts in support for Ukraine. The Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Radosław Sikorski, went a step further some 10 days later, implying that some countries chose not to get involved in the war in Ukraine out of fear and indifference. As he put it, these countries are willing to sacrifice other people's land or freedom for their own peace of mind. Though Italy and Spain, two of Europe's top economies, have also been criticized for their inactivity, France seems to have borne the brunt of the criticism due to the discrepancy between promises and actions. France, for its part, fired back at accusations, claiming that the Kiel Institute's estimates are neither trustworthy nor viable. Later, the French Minister of the Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu, attacked Germany, claiming that the country was reluctant to send the life-changing long-range Taurus KEPD-350 missiles. France, on the other hand, had promised to send 40 or so of these crucial missiles to help Ukraine bolster its defenses against Russia. Germany was also criticized for attempting to go solo and unilaterally pledging over $7 billion in aid for Ukraine. So the situation is clear. Europe's largest economies are in an escalating conflict, and Ukraine will be the only one to pay the price. Why? Well, while the NATO giants are engaging in political bickering and withholding aid, Russia seems to be flourishing. The country's military budget for 2024 has reached a staggering record high of $140 billion. This figure means that Russia will be using roughly 1/3 of all government spending on defense, which sends a clear message. Russia's in it for the long haul. Putin seems to have prepared Russia's economy and the entire country for a lengthy war, raising concerns about a more widespread conflict in Europe. Russia's plans to recruit 300,000 more personnel in 2024 do nothing to quell these fears. If Russia continues to almost miraculously recuperate its lost troops and equipment, Ukraine might not stand a chance of winning the war. And if Ukraine fails, a Russian-NATO conflict is almost a given. Why? We've already mentioned it. There's simply no way Putin will stop at only Ukraine. Military experts believe he's already set his sights on the next targets, the Baltic states. If the war in Ukraine doesn't directly cause a NATO-Russia conflict, what happens after the war almost certainly will. Well, if Russia wins, of course. So what is Putin's plan? It's simple, really. Conquer the former Soviet states that are now NATO members. Move number 2 on our chessboard. The Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, are the first on his list for 3 reasons. Number 1. They have quite sizable Russian-speaking populations, which allows Putin to justify any intervention as protecting Russian citizens abroad, a strategy he used in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Number 2. The fall of Ukraine leaves access to those countries wide open, which in turn means that all of Eastern Europe is within Russia's reach. And number 3. These 3 countries have limited military capabilities on their own, making them relatively easy targets for a freshly energized Russia. Plus, let's be honest, there was simply no way Putin would tolerate being fully surrounded by NATO member countries in Europe. And that's precisely what happened when Finland and Sweden joined NATO after decades of unwavering neutrality. Though Russia's reaction mostly consisted of words, not actions, this move undoubtedly pushed the country closer to an armed conflict with NATO in the future. Move number 3 on our chessboard, if you will. This just leaves us with one more move to go, the first not directly involving Russia or Ukraine, or any European country for that matter. The move in question directly depends on the outcome of the 2024 US presidential election. You see, former President Donald Trump, who's seeking re-election in 2024, has been calling out NATO for years. His primary criticism is that the US pays the lion's share of NATO's budget, while other member countries can't even keep up with their contribution target of 2% of their GDP. He even went as far as to say that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to the countries not paying their dues. From this sentence alone, it's easy to understand why Trump's re-election might lead to an all-out war a lot sooner than we anticipated. If he reduces the US's contribution to NATO or pulls the country out altogether and turns a blind eye to the troubles of other member states, there won't be any stopping Putin. As this life-or-death clock ticks away, potentially counting down the days to a NATO-Russia conflict, an important question emerges. How will this conflict start? Again, we don't have to speculate much. We have a leaked German war game document to paint a vivid picture. Now, to be fair, NATO has publicly distanced itself from this war plan, describing it as an imaginary situation to test military capabilities in a particular area. However, this confidential document composed by the German Ministry of Defense seems pretty realistic given the current situation in Europe. Plus, it provides an updated timeline of the all-out war in Europe, placing it practically behind the corner. With this in mind, let's see when Germany expects an all-out war with Russia and how this war will begin. According to the German Ministry of Defense, the first in the chain of events that'll lead to a war will be Russia's mass mobilization of new military forces that would allow the country to substantially weaken the Ukrainian positions on the battlefield in the coming months. The next stage of the brewing war includes what Russia does best: hybrid warfare. This could entail any of the gray zone strategies Russia is so fond of: recruiting asylum seekers and sending them as spies to enemy countries, pushing tens of thousands of migrants toward an enemy country's border to cause a crisis and overwhelm the country's resources, covertly funding and supporting political movements or parties that align with Russian interests to sow discord and weaken the enemy from within, launching cyber attacks on critical infrastructure such as power grids, transportation systems, and communication networks, using information warfare to spread propaganda, fake news, and disinformation to manipulate public opinion and undermine trust in democratic institutions. You name it, Russia has done it. In Europe, Moscow would likely aim most of these hybrid warfare strategies at the Baltic states, trying to incite the Russian-speaking minorities to create unrest and provide a pretext for intervention. But Russia wouldn't intervene immediately. No, it would first use the crisis in the Baltics to justify a massive military exercise similar to Zapad 2021. This joint strategic exercise between Russian and Belarusian armed forces lasted for 5 days and involved approximately 200,000 military personnel, up to 760 pieces of military equipment, and 15 ships. According to some experts, this exercise was nothing but preparation for the invasion of Ukraine. In that same vein, the possible Zapad 2024 military exercise would set the stage for an attack on Baltic states, and thus NATO. Only this time Russia wouldn't exactly be able to gather so many troops and equipment for the exercise, given how much Russian military resources have been decimated in Ukraine. However, Germany believes that at least 50,000 Russian troops would make their way to Belarus and Western Russia. But still, Russia wouldn't attack. Instead, it would start spreading propaganda that NATO is about to do so. This would be relatively easy for this efficient propaganda machine, as the NATO members would deservingly raise alarms about Russia's actions. While overtly warning about NATO, Russia would covertly move more troops and weapons to Belarus and its Kaliningrad enclave, which just so happens to be situated between Lithuania and Poland. Both NATO members and potential targets for Russia. But these two countries share another thing. an ill-defined 60-mile strip of land called the Suwałki Gap, also referred to as the most dangerous place on Earth and NATO's weak spot in Eastern Europe. But what's the deal with this tiny piece of land? Well, believe it or not, it has huge implications for power dynamics in Europe. Basically, whoever's in control of the Suwałki Gap holds a key strategic position among NATO members. And as you might have guessed, Russia wants this position and the influence over NATO's eastern flank it provides. That's why seizing the Suwałki Gap would be next on Russia's list of priorities. But again, Russia would take its time. According to the German war plan, no direct actions would be taken before the US presidential election took place. It's no secret that Putin is banking on Trump's victory. If this does happen, the US would likely erupt in chaos for a few months, giving Russia the perfect opportunity to start creating artificial border conflicts around the Suwałki Gap. In no time, deadly riots would break out, and what do you know, Russia has no choice but to intervene, just like it did in Ukraine in 2022. This, quote, intervention would require more troops and equipment to be sent to the Suwałki Gap. The German war plan puts that total figure to 70,000 troops in Belarus alone, together with 2 tank divisions, a mechanized infantry division, and a deployable headquarters just outside of NATO borders. This time NATO would be the one that has no choice. The alliance would have to approve the measures for credible deterrence in order to prevent Russia's invasion of the Baltic states and Poland. These measures would likely involve sending at least 300,000 troops to the area, including 30,000 Bundeswehr soldiers. Though this move was meant to be a deterrent strategy, it would likely result in the all-out war we keep mentioning in this video. This means that a major war in Europe could start as early as 2025. Despite NATO distancing itself from this war plan, it seems the alliance is well aware of the possibility. That's why NATO's annual military exercises have gotten bigger than ever. So let's talk Steadfast Defender 2024. Steadfast Defender, taking place from January 22nd to May 31st, 2024, is NATO's largest military exercise since the Cold War. These exercises started back in 1951 as a way to train and test the alliance's newly created military structures. From the very beginning, they involved multiple nations, helping NATO build an integrated military force under a centralized command. Throughout the Cold War, NATO also began testing the alliance's ability to rapidly deploy troops to Europe, which is what Steadfast Defender aims to achieve. The last exercise of this type and scale started in 1969 and continued annually until 1993. The exercise in question is Reforger, short for Return of Forces to Germany, and it has 125,000 participating military personnel. Steadfast Defender might have lasted significantly shorter, but it managed to gather nearly as many soldiers. As many as 90,000 troops from all 32 NATO allies took part in Steadfast Defender 2024, 20,000 of whom came from the UK, 15,000 from Poland, 10,000 from Germany, and 5,000 from the Netherlands, among others. These troops represented all military branches: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Special Operations Forces. Besides troops, Steadfast Defender boasted an impressive number of military equipment involved. We're talking over 80 air platforms, including the F-35 Lightning II, FA-18 Hornet, F-15 Eagle, Harrier, helicopters, and drones. Over 50 ships, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. And over 1,100 combat vehicles, including 533 infantry vehicles, 417 armored personnel carriers, and 166 tanks. Talk about a display of military power. This display took place in Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states, allowing it to meet all its goals. But what goals are we talking about? Number 1 is ensuring the alliance can secure the Euro-Atlantic area. That's what the first phase of Steadfast Defender focused on. The phase in question involved live maritime exercises and amphibious assault training in the North Atlantic and Arctic seas. The phase started with the U.S. forces departing from Norfolk, Virginia, the home of NATO's Joint Force Command, followed by the departure of the Canadian forces from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Number 2 is ensuring the alliance can quickly reinforce its eastern flank in response to any potential aggression. That's what the second phase of Steadfast Defender was for. It involved multi-domain exercises across Europe, focusing on the rapid deployment of troops and equipment within NATO borders. One such exercise is Sabre Strike 2024, organized under the umbrella of the Steadfast Defender. This large-scale field training exercise took place in the Baltics and aimed to train NATO forces for rapid deployment in cold weather conditions. Speaking of cold weather, we must mention the Nordic Response exercise taking place in Norway to enhance the Allies' ability to secure the High North. This crucial exercise involved 20,000 troops, over 50 ships, and over 110 aircraft from over 14 countries. The importance of the alliance's ability to defend every inch of the NATO territory can't be understated, and that's precisely what the brilliant jump test held in Germany and Poland trains the NATO response force to do. Poland also hosted the Dragon 24 exercise, whose goal is to train the Polish land, air, and maritime forces to respond to various military and non-military threats. This exercise involved 20,000 NATO troops from 10 different countries, 15,000 of whom were from the Polish armed forces. In terms of equipment, Dragon 24 used 3,500 pieces of equipment. The sheer scale of Steadfast Defender sent a clear message: NATO is more united and determined than ever. This next phase for the alliance should be demonstrating the willingness to proportionally respond to the Russian hybrid warfare attacks. This way, NATO will show Russia that it can beat it at every front. But this desirable outcome certainly won't come easily. It will require Herculean efforts from NATO countries' industries, militaries, and just as importantly, people. And that's why a portion of the NATO's military committee meeting in Brussels, which brought us the declaration of a future all-out war against Russia, was used to discuss how the countries can prepare for this imminent war. According to Admiral Rob Bauer, the chairman of the military committee, two factors will play the most important role in these preparations: the industrial base and the people. As far as the industrial base goes, it's simple. NATO countries must ramp up weapons production to ensure they can defend the national front first and foremost. The war in Ukraine has drained the stockpiles of weapons and ammunition of most NATO countries, making it imperative to boost production to replenish supplies. After all, this replenishment can take years, and as things stand, we don't have years to act. Especially when Russia has fired up its war machine like never before, drastically speeding up its weapons manufacturing. Okay, this takes care of the weapons, but who's going to wield these weapons? That's where the second important factor comes into play: the people. Or the mobilization of people, to be more precise. If an all-out war breaks out, a large number of civilians will have to be mobilized to support the war effort. NATO countries must, 1, be aware of that, and 2, put a system in place to manage the mobilization process. This is especially important when you consider the fact that most NATO countries have issues with the number of their troops. Take the UK as an example. As of January 1, 2024, the UK Armed Forces consists of 183,130 soldiers, 77.6% of which are regular personnel and Gurkha personnel. The remaining 17.8% is the volunteer reserve personnel. Compared to 2023, these numbers are down 3.7%, and the 2023 numbers were already down 3.9% compared to 2022. The Royal Navy might have it the hardest. Believe it or not, 2 warships had to be decommissioned in order to staff a new class of frigates. That's how few sailors there are in the UK. These and similar scenarios are causing more and more calls for mandatory conscription to bolster military ranks. Some NATO members like Latvia have already done so, while others are seriously considering the move. The UK, for instance, will bring back mandatory national service after 60 years if the ruling Conservative Party wins the national election in July, as promised by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. But top NATO officials emphasized another important task for people living in NATO countries, even if they aren't mobilized. They must prepare themselves for war, both mentally and physically. Physically, this preparation includes preparing emergency kits with essentials like non-perishable food, water, medical supplies, and other necessities, such as a battery-powered radio to stay informed and a flashlight to navigate in dark during power outages. It seems that the Swedish people have already started assembling these kits, as there was a dramatic spike in sales of these devices after Sweden decided to join NATO. Though, to be fair, the spike probably has to do with a rather clumsy attempt made by the Swedish government to prepare their people for war. The Swedish Minister for Civil Defense, Carl Oskar Bolin, was quite direct concerning the matter. There could be war in Sweden. This declaration was followed by a rather ominous campaign on social media, sending a clear message: war is coming. Needless to say, these 3 simple words backfired rather spectacularly. Panic buying of war necessities ensued. Teenagers overwhelmed support hotlines in the country. Social media was flooded with doomsday scenarios. So much so that the Swedish government was eventually forced to apologize for scaring and possibly scarring children. But as aggressive as the campaign was, it had a 100% correct premise. We will all have to accept a new reality sooner or later, and as things are going, the sooner scenario seems like the more plausible one. Do you agree? Do you see an all-out war breaking out between NATO and Russia anytime soon? And if so, when? If, however, you're more optimistic about Europe's future, please do share your reasons why in the comment section below. We could all use some optimism in a time fraught with danger, instability, and insecurity. Now go check out if NATO and Russia go to war, who loses, hour by hour, or click this other video instead.
In a world already on edge, Putin's latest gambit, a ramp-up of tactical nuclear weapons drills, sends shivers down the spine. Amidst the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, this chilling announcement serves as a stark warning to the West. But what's behind this sudden escalation? Is it mere posturing, or is there a genuine threat that Russia could unleash nuclear chaos if Western boots, such as those from France, land on Ukrainian soil? Strap in as we dive into the dark heart of this nuclear standoff to uncover the truths that lie behind the surface. Let's unravel the reality behind Russia's nuclear threats. Russia's Ministry of Defense said the exercise will be done to practice the issues of preparation and use of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons have no official definition, but they are generally low-yield arms of shorter range designed to be used against enemy forces on the battlefield rather than against large population centers. They are often forward-deployed to bases and may come in the form of not just bombs, but torpedoes, artillery, or even mines. Russia has about 1,558 tactical nuclear weapons, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. While it is modernizing these weapons, NATO's conventional superiority and Western military aid are challenging Russia's position. Despite mounting losses in Ukraine and strategic disadvantages, Moscow's emphasis on its nuclear forces highlights its struggle to maintain parity. The resilience and strategic advancements of Ukraine, supported by Western technology and aid, continue to pose significant challenges to Russia. Russia's tactical nuclear weapons include an estimated 784 in its navy. These come mostly in the form of cruise missiles. There are about 334 in its air force, mostly delivered by bombers, though some fighter aircraft, like the Su-57, are also thought to be capable of using them. The remainder consists of ground-launched missiles. The nuclear exercises will include missile forces in Russia's southern military district, which is headquartered at Rostov-on-Don, and covers the battlefields in eastern and southern Ukraine. The Russian Navy and aerospace forces will participate in the drills. But why would Russia resort to an exercise in the use of these weapons at this particular time? After all, 2024 has mostly been good for the Russian cause in Ukraine, if you count minor territorial gains at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties to be a good thing. These results were good enough for Vladimir Putin, at least, for him to be re-elected as the president of Russia with no difficulty, so the idea that Russian elites dissatisfied with the war would oust him from power is a more distant prospect now. But the summer might be better for Ukraine. Russia has only been as successful as it has this year because of Ukraine's ammunition shortages. In April, Christopher Cavoli, the highest-ranking American general in Europe, mentioned that Russia was firing 5 times as many shells as Ukraine. That's now about to change. In February, the Czech Republic announced that it had identified 800,000 available artillery shells in non-Western countries. The next month, the Czechs found an additional 700,000 shells. Western powers soon began purchasing both sets. In the next couple of months, these shells will arrive in bulk on the Ukrainian battlefields. In April, the United States Congress passed an aid package for the first time in 6 months. Worth $61 billion for Ukraine in total, the bill includes $14 billion worth of weapons and ammunition shipments for the Ukrainian military, including artillery shells and ATACMS missiles. These developments put much further pressure on the Russian military, and on April 21st, the Institute for the Study of War suggested that it would try its best to make the most of the closing window of opportunity. Russian forces will likely intensify ongoing offensive operations and missile and drone strikes in the coming weeks in order to exploit the closing window of Ukrainian materiel constraints. To add to the notion of a closing window of opportunity for Russia, Western leaders have been more adamant in their rhetoric that Putin's invasion not be allowed to succeed, even if it means loosening the constraints on the Ukrainian military. French President Emmanuel Macron was the most prominent such leader. In February, shortly after the fall of Avdiivka, he refused to rule out the idea that Europe should send troops to Ukraine. Macron argued that other taboos had not been broken before. Many people who say never never today were the same people who said never tanks, never planes, never long-range missiles 2 years ago. Let us have the humility to note that we have often been 6 to 12 months late. If you're a regular viewer of us here at the Military Show, then you know that truth is often stranger than fiction. But what do you do when you need a way to keep track of both? Well, we've found a solution, and that's why we're so excited to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, World Anvil. Designed to support creators from all walks of life, whether you're a writer, artist, streamer, game designer, historian, or hobbyist. Their powerful tools help you break down, organize, visualize, and plan out your creative endeavors. With features like interactive maps, chronicles, timelines, and newly enhanced diplomacy webs. Are you an RPG game master? World Anvil supports over 45 systems including D&D 5e, or you can create your own. While players will love World Anvil's extensive character management system, featuring character sheets, journals, inventory management, and spellbooks. But what if you're a writer who wants to create your own universe? With 25 world-building article templates, you can create wiki-style presentations of your world, making it easier than ever to write, organize, and even publish your stories. What we found most impressive, though, are the interactive maps and chronicles feature that allow you to plot events across time and space, truly bringing your narrative to life. Plus, with the new major update to timelines, organizing complex scenes, scenarios, and events has never been simpler. Ready to start forging your own world? Just go to worldanvil.com or use the link in the description, and be sure to use the code MILITARYSHOW to get 51% off any yearly subscription, giving you access to all the incredible features World Anvil has to offer. Again, that's worldanvil.com, and use the code MILITARYSHOW to start exploring, creating, and sharing with World Anvil right now. Macron also mentioned in his recent appearances that Russia was the sole aggressor and that Europe would need to do whatever it could to ensure that it did not come out of the war as the victor. More recent comments by other leaders suggested that the West's attitude was shifting toward letting the Ukrainians be more aggressive with the weapons they received. On May 2nd, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron promised nearly $4 billion of annual unilateral aid to Ukraine for as long as the war would last. Importantly, he added that Britain would have no problem with Ukraine using British weapons to attack targets on Russian soil. He said that such a move would be part of Ukraine's right to defend itself, and particularly appropriate given Russia's conduct inside Ukrainian territory. Such long-range weapons would include the British Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missile, which can hit targets at least 155 miles away, though experts believe they might be able to go longer. These weapons are ideal for striking vital military assets deep behind enemy lines, such as command and control centers or supply depots. Ukraine has successfully demonstrated its ability to use these missiles in Crimea as part of a campaign that has forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to retreat from its traditional base at Sevastopol. Its most notable success was the damaging of the Russian submarine Rostov-na-Don on September 23rd. On April 23rd, the British government pledged additional Storm Shadows as part of the largest aid package it ever passed for Ukraine. Worth $622 million in total, the British package includes 1,600 offensive and defensive missiles, including more Storm Shadows. France pledged its version of the Storm Shadow, called Scalp, shortly afterward. As this rhetoric and news of additional Western military aid was heating up, the Russian government warned that the talk of sending NATO troops to Ukraine amounted to a new round of escalation, and in March, Putin said that it would be a short step to World War III from that perspective, a war he insisted no one wanted. In the first half of 2023, NATO also held its largest exercises since the Cold War, called Steadfast Defender, which practiced the deployment and cooperation of all alliance members across the Atlantic and the length and breadth of the European continent. This operation, too, saw a loud protest from Russia. Russia was making incremental and costly gains when Ukraine was suffering a severe shortage of weapons and ammunition. That situation will no longer be the case in the second half of the year, putting much greater pressure on Putin, who can now expect far higher losses. To answer the question of whether Putin would resort to using nuclear weapons in the presence of French troops, as Macron hinted though, we first need to look at Russia's nuclear doctrine. Russia's official nuclear doctrine permits the use of such weapons in the event of an enemy attack using weapons of mass destruction or conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened. Like the American nuclear football, the briefcase with the Russian nuclear launch controls, called the Cheget, is with the President of the Russian Federation at all times. Russia's defense minister and chief of general staff have their own nuclear briefcases. The Cheget allows the president to communicate with the top military commanders and to the related nuclear forces via the Kazbek command and control network. In 2019, Russia's state Zvezda television channel revealed footage of what it said was the Cheget. In a section called Command, there were two buttons, the white launch button and the red cancel button. Like in the United States, the president has the sole authority to order a nuclear attack. If Putin thought that Russia was coming under a serious enough threat, he would be able to send a launch order to the Russian military, which would quickly reach its nuclear forces. If necessary, Russia has a dead hand or perimeter computer network that could carry out the order on an automated basis. Although Russia's official nuclear doctrine would seem to renounce the idea of a first strike, this is not the case. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union adopted an official no first use policy with regards to nuclear weapons, but this was never truly sincere. For example, the Soviets considered launching a preemptive nuclear attack during NATO's Able Archer 83 exercise. In 1993, the new Russian Federation officially dropped the no first use policy. Meanwhile, since Russia is a dictatorship anyway, official laws and policy count for little. If Putin wills it, there will be a nuclear strike. There is no countermanding authority that would stop him from launching an attack if he was dead set on it. Indeed, some hardliners in Russia want Putin to loosen the country's nuclear doctrine, although he said last year that he saw no reason to make a change. Putin's latest nuclear comments and news of the exercises were met with relative ambivalence in Ukraine and in the West, as have his other overtures to nuclear weapons since the war began. Andriy Yusov, an official with Ukraine's military intelligence, said that nuclear blackmail is a constant practice of Putin's regime in response. Indeed, such practices have been common since the start of the war. Days after the invasion began, Putin ordered his nuclear forces to be put on a state of special alert. This was likely an attempt to discourage the West from supporting Ukraine with weapons and money. That obviously didn't work. In September 2022, as Russian forces were in retreat in the face of Ukraine's counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts, Putin boasted that Russia had unrivaled weapons of mass destruction and that he would use any means available to defend the homeland. "I'm not bluffing," Putin insisted. As if to make the matter clearer, Putin decided to deploy some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus in the summer of 2023. Old Soviet bases built for the purpose of hosting such weapons were reactivated. None of these nuclear-related actions had any effect on the war, though, either on the battlefield or on the diplomatic front. This is why Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling hasn't made much of an impression on anyone. But what if Macron followed up on his rhetoric and French troops got involved? Would this unlikely event make Putin's nuclear threats more than just talk? One must admit that the presence of French troops on Ukraine's soil would be a significant new development in the war. How would Putin react? Would he consider it an existential threat? First, we must note that the presence of French troops alone would not necessarily mean the escalation of the war in Ukraine into World War III. NATO is a defensive alliance only. The North Atlantic Treaty does not obligate its members to assist one another if one of them takes part in an overseas expedition on its own initiative. Suppose Macron and the French government decided to send some troops to reinforce Ukraine. That would be a decision from Paris alone. If the French intended to take such unilateral action, they would not be able to rely on their NATO allies to come to the defense of their forces in Ukraine. The lack of involvement from the rest of NATO may convince Putin that Russia is not under existential threat and need not use nuclear weapons in retaliation. There would also be another consideration. Although Russia has isolated itself from much of the world with its decision to invade Ukraine, it nevertheless depends on a series of relationships with other countries in order to keep its economy afloat, its forces supplied, and its society running. Breaking the nuclear taboo would put these relationships under strain. North Korea likely wouldn't care and continue supplying Russia with artillery shells and other weapons, but the relationship with Pyongyang isn't exactly the most important one. Three relationships in particular have been of pivotal interest for a warring Russia. The first of these is with Turkey. Turkey has sold weapons to Ukraine, particularly its Bayraktar TB2 drone. It's also closed the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the ships of the Russian Navy, in line with the 1936 Montreux Convention, preventing the Russian Black Sea Fleet from being reinforced. Nevertheless, Turkey has not been as severe with Russia as the rest of its NATO allies. Turkey has avoided joining the Western sanctions regime and has become the fourth largest customer for Russian energy exports. In the pre-war years, Turkey attempted to use its relationship with Russia as part of a strategy of geopolitical hedging. Despite Turkey's insistence that Crimea be returned to Ukraine and tensions with Russia in Syria, it attempted to maintain good relations. The best example was its decision to purchase the S-400 air defense system, in a move which brought American sanctions and its exclusion from the F-35 program. For Turkey, though, fostering the relationship with Russia was a way to balance against the West. Since the West was opposed to some of Turkey's moves in the Middle East, particularly against the Kurds, hedging with Russia was a matter of strategic importance for the government in Ankara. There are also certain ideological ties. Under the leadership of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has gone through a period of democratic backsliding and growing authoritarianism. Like Putin, Erdogan has been called a proponent of the civilization state theory, and he has grown Turkey's reach beyond its borders in moves which some experts call attempts at a neo-Ottoman foreign policy. Nevertheless, if Russia were to cross the nuclear threshold, it's hard to see how Turkey would be able to maintain the relationship. In a nuclear scenario, Turkey is particularly endangered, not just because of its geography and its membership in the NATO alliance, but because it hosts American tactical nuclear weapons on its soil. Keeping the nuclear genie in its lamp is in Turkey's best interests, and its failure to mount much greater opposition to Russia in that scenario would force the West's hand in dealing with the so-called odd man out of NATO. Russia using nuclear weapons would force Turkey to choose the West and completely shun Russia for its own economic survival. India is the second critical relationship for the post-invasion Russia. Indian purchases of Russian energy have helped Moscow to weather the storm of Western sanctions, and it's now Russia's third-largest customer. India has had a long-running security relationship with Russia as well, with New Delhi keen to purchase weapons such as the S-400 and T-90 tank. However, India has been between something of a rock and a hard place with its relationship with Russia. It's traditionally a non-aligned country, but its primary national security challenge is from a more aggressive China. Such a challenge has drawn India steadily into the American foreign policy orbit, especially through the quadrilateral security dialogue. Deadly border clashes between 2020 and 2022 reinforce the importance of the relationship with the United States. India has so far successfully managed to walk the tightrope between the United States and Russia. Since countering China is also Washington's highest geopolitical priority, it's tolerated India's cozier relationship with Russia. However, all bets would be off in the event that Russia went nuclear in Ukraine. Like Turkey, India would almost certainly be forced to renounce its relationship with Russia for the sake of its trade with the much larger economies of the West and because of its national security interests. And what about China? The relationship with Beijing is by far Moscow's most important. China is now Russia's largest energy customer. It's also a critical source for electronic components and other vital goods that have been targeted by Western sanctions. Russian foreign reserves are now filled with Chinese currency thanks to the exploding trade between the two countries. Unfortunately for Russia, this currency isn't good for much other than trade, and because the economies of the West are now cut off, Moscow must keep trading with China to survive. It can't hedge its bets. China has understood this advantage and used it. Xi Jinping might agree with Putin in his attempts to undermine the US-led international order, but he has so far not been willing to provide military aid for fear of cutting off trade with the West. In a statement following Xi's summit with Putin in 2023, both leaders agreed that all nuclear powers should refrain from deploying such weapons beyond their national borders. Russia's deployment of tactical nukes to Belarus came only months later and may have been an attempt to break the mold that it's now the junior partner in the relationship. Russia's use of these weapons would be a completely different story. If Xi was reluctant to provide military aid for fear of upsetting trade relationships with the West before, Russia's use of nuclear weapons would leave him with little choice but to play a much more forceful hand against Russia. China's economy is already showing signs of trouble. It grew by only 3% in 2022, low by its standards, and has entered a general decline in growth since Xi took power. If Russia broke the nuclear taboo and China refused to join the world in imposing costs for such behavior, it would suffer severely from the severance of relations with the West, which are already under strain. For these reasons, the presence of French troops on Ukrainian soil would not necessarily lead to Putin using nuclear weapons, especially if they are small in number. However, if France launched a full-scale deployment, Russian forces in Ukraine would be in serious trouble. Russia has suffered enormously against a Ukrainian military that it is outnumbered and outgunned. It's reasonable to assume that a better equipped and better trained French force would do far more damage. In the face of Putin potentially being unable to win the war on a conventional basis, the temptation to use tactical nuclear weapons to turn the tide would increase. But France is a nuclear-armed nation, and so Putin would face the awful conundrum of losing the war and losing power, or facing nuclear retaliation and the loss of Russia's most important trading relationships. Hopefully in such a scenario, Russia's elite would decide to pack him off and ship him to an isolated dacha before anything too drastic comes to pass. The prospect of French intervention, especially without its allies, remains unlikely. Nevertheless, Macron's statements and Putin's latest round of nuclear saber-rattling show us how high the stakes are in the game of nations these days. After the end of the Cold War, the people of the world had high hopes that such things were behind them, but history never truly ends. What do you think Putin would do if France or another Western country decided to intervene unilaterally in Ukraine? Could this escalate to crossing the nuclear threshold? And what would be the consequences for Russia even without nuclear retaliation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more expert military analysis. In the 75 years of its existence, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, has proven to be history's most successful military alliance. It was NATO that helped end the Cold War without direct military confrontation between superpowers and without a single shot fired. It was NATO that ushered in an era of peace and stability in the Balkans after its decisive intervention in the conflict of the 90s. It was NATO that made the successful global war on terrorism possible following the September 11 attacks. And it was NATO that has finally proven that Russia isn't invincible. Talk about a legacy. But why does the last achievement warrant a place of such significance in NATO's history? It's because Russia's perceived invincibility has been the cornerstone of its military strategy and political influence. It was only a few years ago that Russia's President Vladimir Putin declared Russia stronger than any other country in the world. His exact words were, "We can say with certainty, we are stronger now than any potential aggressor. Anyone." This aggressive posturing allowed Russia to get away with annexing Crimea, supporting separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, and intervening in Syria without any significant consequences. But after Russia brutally and illegally invaded Ukraine, NATO has seemingly decided that enough is enough. The alliance backed Ukraine with unwavering resolve, sending a clear message to Russia: there is someone stronger. As the war in Ukraine raged on, it became clear that Putin was the one who should fear a clash with NATO, not the other way around. As one columnist puts it, going against NATO would be political and military suicide for Putin. But what did NATO do exactly to show Putin he was treading on dangerous ground? It's simple really. The alliance stopped Russia in all domains, military, political, and economic. For every Russian action, there was a response, moves and countermoves. With this in mind, let's explore how Russia learned a valuable lesson: don't mess with NATO. To understand just how vital NATO's role in the war in Ukraine has been, let's take you back to the beginning of the Russian invasion. Putin's initial strategy was to seize Kyiv within the first 2 days of the campaign. That's how much he underestimated Ukraine and its allies, and how much confidence he had in Russia's military might. It seems that he, too, bought into his own propaganda. But 2 years later, Kyiv is still standing. Ukraine has not only defended its territory, but also dealt some devastating blows to the Russian forces. Of course, Ukraine only managed to do so thanks to the unwavering support of NATO and its allies. Now, Ukraine isn't a NATO member, at least not yet. This means that the alliance can't establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine or send in NATO troops to battle Russia, but it can, however, send aid. Sending aid to Ukraine was NATO's first message to Russia. We can and we will stand against your aggression, no matter the cost. And this wasn't some sort of an implied message. In November 2022, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, said loud and clear, "NATO will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will not back down." When Russia started devastating Ukraine's military capabilities, NATO responded by providing Ukraine with more weapons, more training, and more intelligence. Here are just some of the notable military systems and equipment Ukraine has received from NATO since the beginning of the invasion. Western-made Iris-T air defense systems, US-made Patriot missile defense systems, US-made FIM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense systems MANPADS, Norwegian advanced surface-to-air missile systems NASAMS, Soviet-designed 9K-32 Strela manpads, US-made M142 high-mobility artillery rocket systems HIMARS, US-made M270 multiple-launch rocket systems, US-made AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles AMRAAMs, US-made AGM-88 HARM air-to-surface anti-radiation missiles, US-made Harpoon missiles, US-made M1 Abrams main battle tanks, German Leopard 2 main battle tanks, US-made FGM-148 Javelin anti-tank systems, UK-made M777 howitzers, French Caesar howitzers, German Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, Canadian Stryker armored fighting vehicles, US-made Bradley fighting vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition of various calibers, artillery rounds, and mortar rounds. Ukraine is also expecting dozens of US-made F-16 Fighting Falcon jets to arrive in 2024 from countries like Denmark and the Netherlands. These advanced fighter jets could finally give Ukraine air superiority, which Russia has held since the beginning of the invasion, although not too convincingly. Though not all of the US-made weapons we've listed were given to Ukraine by the US, this country is still Ukraine's #1 military aid donor by a margin. Of course, the US is also the most prominent member of NATO, which goes to show that NATO as a whole has been instrumental in helping Ukraine resist Russia. Now, there are some fears that the US's involvement in NATO might significantly lessen if Donald Trump gets re-elected for president in November 2024. Trump's former national security advisor John Bolton even believes that he might pull the US out of NATO altogether if he wins, putting NATO in real jeopardy. That's why many experts believe Putin wants and needs Trump to win. But the bad news for Putin and the skeptics is that NATO can hold its own even without the US's involvement. After all, we're looking at a coalition of over 30 countries, some of which, like the UK, Germany and France, have enviable military capabilities and a strong commitment to NATO's collective defense. This was also proven through the aid to Ukraine, as the European Union countries provided the most military, financial and humanitarian aid combined. We're talking over $92 billion in aid, most of which was financial. In comparison, the US has committed over $70 billion in financial and military aid alone. For its part, NATO is primarily helping coordinate requests for aid and the delivery of the aid itself, both humanitarian and non-lethal. However, as of 2024, there have been proposals for the alliance to take on a more significant role in coordinating military assistance as well. But NATO's most important role in delivering aid to Ukraine is guaranteed by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. The article unequivocally states that an armed attack against one NATO member will be considered an attack against them all. This article thus gives Ukraine's allies peace of mind that they won't diminish their own security by helping the warring country. Most importantly, this aid isn't a one-and-done type of assistance. NATO allies have committed to supporting Ukraine in the long run, helping the country transition from Soviet-era to NATO standards. This brings us to another crucial way NATO has demonstrated its superiority over Russia by taking Russia's perceived enemies and potential targets under its wing. Russia has historically used NATO expansion as a justification for its aggressive actions, claiming it needs to protect itself from the alliance. So what did NATO do? Expand more, of course. Despite Russia's vehement opposition, the country's neighbors Finland and Sweden joined the alliance on April 4, 2023 and March 7, 2024 respectively. In an even bigger slap to Russia's face, NATO's chief Jens Stoltenberg reiterated that the door to membership in the alliance remains open to all, including Ukraine. Ukraine's accession to NATO was already agreed upon at the 2008 Bucharest summit, but for this accession to take place, Ukraine has to complete two steps. Number 1, Ukraine must submit an application to the Membership Action Plan (MAP), NATO's comprehensive assessment of the country's political, economic and military capabilities. Number 2, Ukraine must resolve any ongoing conflicts and territorial disputes. Step 1 was achieved at the 2023 Vilnius summit. This essentially means that Ukraine is free to join NATO once the war with Russia ends. But why does Ukraine's potential accession to NATO matter? It matters because this potential accession is one of the reasons Russia attacked Ukraine in the first place. By still keeping the door open to Ukraine, NATO has taken a resolute stand for freedom and security in the face of tyranny. The open door is not just an invitation, it's a clear message to those like Russia who would seek to divide and conquer. Your actions won't go unchallenged. Plus, let's not forget, if Ukraine were to join NATO, Russia would be fully surrounded by NATO members in Europe. Finland and Sweden's accession have already brought NATO's land borders with Russia to an impressive 754 miles. So if Russia was to go against NATO, it wouldn't battle it out with one militarily inferior country like it did with Ukraine. It will be looking at a formidable coalition that has unprecedented land access to its territory. Ironically, this is precisely what Putin wanted to prevent from happening. Most of the Kremlin leaders before him, Dmitry Medvedev, Boris Yeltsin, Mikhail Gorbachev, worried about NATO getting too big and too close to Russia, but Putin was essentially the one to make this happen. NATO's expansion in the region has been especially welcomed by the Baltic states, i.e. Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia. But why? Because these states are often quoted as Russia's next targets after Ukraine. But once again, NATO isn't just sitting idly by and letting Russia think the whole of Europe is at its mercy. The alliance is adamant about putting a stop to Russia's reckless antics, regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends. So just as NATO has supported Ukraine, the alliance has stood firmly behind the Baltic states. For starters, NATO is sending a permanent German brigade to Lithuania. This brigade will consist of 4,800 soldiers dedicated to defending the country's eastern flank. Canada has also been working on forming a similar brigade in Latvia by 2026. This brigade should consist of 2,200 persistently deployed Canadian Armed Forces members, with the country ready to deploy hundreds more if needed. As for Estonia, its NATO brigade will come from the UK, but its deployment will be at a time of need. These permanent brigades will soon join some 40,000 troops NATO has already deployed in the eastern part of the alliance since Russian aggression began. Granted, these troops are supported by tens of thousands of national troops deployed by each NATO member country in the region. At the moment, NATO's eastern flank consists of 8 distinct battle groups deployed in Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. This means that the area all the way from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south is densely fortified with NATO troops. This is another major blow to Russia, as the country is estimated to have lost nearly 500,000 troops in the war in Ukraine. Sure, the Kremlin has also mobilized 300,000 troops in late 2022 and plans to mobilize another 300,000 by June 2024. But these new soldiers are highly inexperienced and inadequately trained, which essentially means Russia is sending them to their death. Worst of all, Russia is well aware of this. The country's military leadership voluntarily employs the so-called meat grinder strategy that entails soldiers attacking in waves to wear down Ukrainian forces. These soldiers may be successful in doing so, as well as exposing strategic locations to the Russian artillery, but they pay for this success with their lives. Whereas NATO has adopted a strategy focused on deterrence and defense. This approach not only demonstrates the alliance's commitment to collective defense, but also underscores the stark contrast between NATO's values and Russia's brutal tactics. Numbers-wise, NATO collectively has about 2.5 times more active duty soldiers than Russia, 3.39 million versus 1.32 million. However, some Western countries aren't satisfied with the current numbers, especially with the prospect of Russia trying to invade Europe. That's why there's been a lot of talk about making conscription mandatory again. One of the endangered Baltic states, Latvia, has already done so, bringing back compulsory military service in 2023. That said, deterring Russian forces will take much more than just the return of military draft, and NATO is well aware of that. Luckily, NATO is already significantly superior to Russia in essentially all regards: land power, air power, and naval power, as you'll see later in the video. The only aspect where NATO and Russia are more evenly matched is in terms of nuclear weapons. As of 2024, there are over 12,000 total nuclear warheads in the world. Russia alone possesses 5,500 of them. The 3 nuclear forces within NATO, the US, UK, and France, have approximately the same number combined. Of course, the vast majority of these warheads is owned by the US, as many as 5,000, while the UK and France have 225 and 290 respectively. But the issue isn't in the number of nuclear weapons, it's the nuclear doctrine of these opposing sides. NATO's nuclear doctrine is primarily one of deterrence, meaning that these weapons are only intended to prevent conflict rather than escalate it. In contrast, Russia has shown an unparalleled willingness to use nuclear threats as part of its military strategy. In fact, Russia's nuclear weapons, and the country's carelessness about them, have consistently been Putin's strongest bargaining chip in Ukraine. The thinly veiled threats turned into action in May of 2024 when Putin publicly announced tactical nuclear weapons drills in response to Western provocative statements and threats. He has also stashed an unknown number of nuclear weapons in Belarus, which borders 3 NATO members, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. So how has NATO responded to Russia's nuclear coercion? By sticking to its guns, as always. NATO's nuclear deterrence policy has proven successful throughout the Cold War and beyond, on all occasions when the risk of nuclear warfare was at its highest. The deterrence strategy also involves stashing nuclear weapons at secure military bases throughout Europe. As of 2023, 5 NATO member countries, Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, store over 100 US-owned nuclear weapons. In 2024, this list might expand, as Poland has declared it's ready to host nuclear weapons on its territory if NATO decides to reinforce its eastern flank in this way as well. Since Russia has brought nuclear weapons to Polish borders via Belarus, it's only logical for Poland to react and for NATO to consider bolstering its own nuclear presence in the region. But as important as it was for NATO to show its superiority military-wise, it was also crucial for the alliance to isolate the country internationally. That's where NATO's economic warfare and information warfare tactics come into play. These tactics have a singular goal: to weaken Russia's strategic position and starve the Kremlin's war machine of resources. And that's precisely what they've accomplished. In terms of economic warfare, Russia has been heavily sanctioned since the beginning of the invasion, having over $300 billion of its international assets frozen so far. These sanctions have targeted critical sectors of the Russian economy, including finance, energy, and defense, crippling Russia's ability to sustain its military efforts. The coordinated economic measures have also involved restrictions on Russian banks, limiting their access to international financial systems, and placing embargoes on key exports and imports. Of course, NATO can't take all of the credit for this, as numerous countries outside the alliance have also imposed their own punitive measures against Russia. However, NATO's coordination and leadership have been pivotal in rallying international support and ensuring the sanctions are comprehensive and effective. As of 2024, the total number of sanctions against Russian businesses and people has surpassed 16,500. A significant chunk of these has come from NATO countries, with the US and Canada leading the way with 3,500 and 2,700 sanctions respectively. This just goes to show the amount of power NATO wields once its member countries come together. And it's precisely this unity that's the main reason why Russia will lose against NATO if it ever dares challenge the alliance. If the war in Ukraine has shown one thing, it's that NATO will go above and beyond to protect its members. And remember, Ukraine isn't even a NATO member, so imagine what the alliance would do if one of its own were threatened. With this in mind, let's see how NATO and Russia stack up against each other in terms of military capabilities. But before we start, remember one thing: it's not all about the numbers. Even if Russia does appear powerful in a specific category, quality always trumps quantity. And Russia, for the most part, is relying on aging equipment and infrastructure after failing to properly invest in its military capabilities ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Plus, all the Western sanctions haven't exactly done these capabilities any favors, forcing Russia to scavenge its stocks for outdated technology and cut corners on maintenance and upgrades. NATO, on the other hand, mostly boasts state-of-the-art equipment backed by the latest technological advancements and rigorous maintenance standards. The alliance's investment in cutting-edge technology, from stealth fighter jets to cyber defense systems, ensures its forces are always prepared for modern warfare. Without further ado, let's explore these forces in more detail. First up, military personnel. We've already mentioned the fact that NATO has significantly more active duty troops than Russia, but this superiority also applies to all the other relevant categories. Russia has about 2 million reservists, NATO has over 3.4 million. Russia wields some 250,000 paramilitary units, NATO has almost 800,000. Prior to the war in Ukraine, this vast difference perhaps wouldn't matter as much. Why? Because Russia is known for valuing the professionalism and training of its armed forces. That's why, unlike most Western countries, Russia has had a mandatory conscription system for over 100 years. Most male citizens between 18 and 30 are drafted for a 12-month service. Plus, let's not forget that Russian forces are centralized, unlike NATO's, or at least they were. The war in Ukraine changed everything. Now NATO is the one with the upper hand, having demonstrated its unmatched interoperability on multiple occasions since the start of the invasion. The invasion also had a significant impact on the military budgets of both parties. Russia has never spent more on defense than it plans to in 2024. The country's military spending has risen to an astounding 7.1% of its GDP, which accounts for 35% of total government spending. Yet Russia's military budget still pales in comparison to the combined spending of NATO member countries. To put things into perspective, the US alone spends more on defense than Russia and about 9 more countries on the list of the top military spenders combined. But even if we take the US out of the equation, NATO's European member states still spend more on defense than Russia, at least 2 times more. And with Russia's 2024 military budget reported to be a historic $140 billion, this ratio truly speaks volumes. Though other NATO countries might not have such massive military budgets, they do all try to devote a minimum of 2% of their GDP to defense. This fact once again underscores the unity of NATO and the willingness of each member to pull their weight in the collective defense efforts. Naturally, these efforts primarily rest on strengthening the alliance's aerial, land, and naval resources. So let's see how NATO compares to Russia in this regard. In terms of land power, it's estimated that NATO would be able to deploy more tanks than Russia in the event of conflict. This is a major accomplishment for the alliance, given that Russia is the #1 country in the world by total number of tanks, starting 2024 with over 14,000 vehicles. But let's not forget, Russia is also losing tanks on almost a daily basis. Plus, the tanks that Russia does use on the battlefield were mostly made during the Soviet era, which has led to concerns about their reliability in combat. NATO, on the other hand, has nothing to worry about. Its tank fleet is packed with modern models like the German Leopard 2, British Challenger 2, and French Leclerc, which put most Soviet-designed tanks to shame. A similar sentiment is present when comparing NATO and Russia's aerial resources. According to some estimates, NATO has about 4 to 5 times the aerial resources of Russia. Plus, NATO's fleet includes an impressive array of advanced fighter jets, like the Eurofighter Typhoon, Dassault Rafale, and Saab Gripen. And this is all without even accounting for the US-made superstars like the F-35 Lightning II, which is among the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Combined, these fighter jets provide unparalleled aerial supremacy and multi-role capabilities, allowing NATO to rise to virtually any occasion. As for the naval capabilities, NATO is estimated to have 4 times as many ships as Russia, but the number doesn't even matter as much as the effectiveness of the two navies in combat. Russia's Black Sea Navy, once seen as one of the most formidable in the region, has outright embarrassed itself during the war against Ukraine. So much so that only 1 ship is now estimated to remain in the region, while the rest were damaged, destroyed, or simply sent back to base by Ukraine's clever military tactics. And Ukraine doesn't even have a proper navy. Imagine what NATO's united naval forces could do against such a weakened enemy. All in all, it becomes increasingly clear why going against NATO would be a terrible mistake for Putin. Even more terrible than going after Ukraine in the first place. But remember, it's Putin we're talking about, the same man who seems willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve his goals. That's why some experts believe that a direct clash between Russia and NATO might be inevitable. However, most of these experts are still sticking to the fact that NATO's victory over Russia is also inevitable. After all, the security of the whole of Europe hinges on this victory. Of course, this won't make the fight any less ugly, especially when you consider how emboldened Russia has become recently, thanks to the capture of Avdiivka and Pobeda and successful strides toward Bakhmut, Donetsk City, Robotyne, and Kreminna. If Russia defeats Ukraine, a clash with NATO might happen a lot sooner than we imagine. But what do you think? Is the NATO versus Russia battle truly on the cards in the near future? And if so, who do you see winning? But if you believe that the war in Ukraine was enough to deter Russia from any further aggression, we'd be interested to know which NATO move you think made the biggest impact. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Now go and check out why the war in Ukraine shows the US military would destroy the Russian military, or click this other video instead. A war between Russia and NATO might seem impossible. After all, NATO currently consists of 32 member countries, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and most of Europe. Collectively, NATO forces dwarf those of Russia, both in terms of quantity and quality. So how could a NATO-Russia war possibly come to pass? Well, as uncomfortable as it might be to consider, there are a few possibilities. For example, as very nearly came to pass in the 1980s, what if a NATO wargame was misinterpreted by Russian intelligence as cover for an assault on the motherland, leading to a preemptive strike? What if Russia decided to invade a smaller member state on its border, pushing the red lines and seeing if NATO, most importantly the US, responded? The history between Russia and NATO has long been tense. Despite a brief thaw after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, these tensions are back at a deep freeze. In fact, relations are arguably the worst they've been for half a century. Some have even said we're in a new Cold War. Join us as we delve into this hypothetical matchup and scenario, which aims to illustrate one key point: the US's involvement and leadership are critical. Without it, who knows what might happen. Hour 0. After years of planning, Putin's generals give the go-ahead. They want a much further divide between Russia's borders and NATO countries. Their target? Lithuania and the Baltic states. Taking Lithuania cuts Latvia and Estonia off from Europe, leaving them primed and ready for a further Russian advance. It's not just a territorial expanse, though. The Russians feel utterly betrayed by NATO and the US in particular. As the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO officials had indicated, but not in any legally binding manner, that NATO would avoid further eastward expansion, ensuring the new Russia didn't feel vulnerable. But it had reneged on that promise, and Russia was, and still is, deeply angry. Any potential trust was dead in the water as soon as any countries bordering Russia joined NATO, leading to the inevitable re-escalation of tension and the potential for a new cold or hot war. The ongoing war in Ukraine hasn't gone as planned. As of early mid-2024, Russian armed forces have taken a beating, with only around 1,750 tanks left in operational service, and that includes a few antiques. It has around 1,200 bombers, fighters, and attack aircraft left. But Russia must never be underestimated. Its infantry is even larger than in 2022 at the start of the Ukraine war, and despite significant equipment and vehicle losses, the production chain is ramping up, and close relations with allies like China and Iran mean more and more piling into the inventory every day. After months of testing and probing, including airspace and naval violations, as well as amassing troops on the border, Russia has seen little military response from Lithuania's NATO allies. Western leaders have verbally condemned Russia's thinly veiled threats, yet nobody has sent missiles, ships, jets, or reinforcements to their small ally. Okay, hour zero rolls around. Judgment time. It's the middle of the night. The few hundred tanks Russia has left, removed from the war in Ukraine, are lined up on Lithuania's border. They fire up their engines and, escorted by 100,000 troops, mostly newly conscripted, approach the crossings. Simultaneously, GPS and radar jamming cripples Lithuanian navigation and communication systems, protecting the Russian soldiers and armaments from most missiles. Russia launches a barrage of thousands of sea and air-launched missiles, along with Iranian-built drones, first using its weaker, cheaper, and more disposable subsonic models. Lithuania has very few air defense units, and NATO hasn't finished ratifying the deal that will see the country host its more advanced launchers. The country's aerial defenses will be swiftly overwhelmed, at which point the supersonic and hypersonic arsenal will come into play. Simultaneously, Russia launches its spare 4th and 5th generation fighter jets, including older Sukhoi 27s and MiG-29s, as well as their newer counterparts, the Su-30, Su-35s, and a couple of brand new Su-57s. The Lithuanian Air Force, the LTAF, has no chance. No matter how excellent their training is, the numbers are overwhelming. Their 6 or so active aircraft are mostly helicopters and transport planes, no match for modern multi-purpose jets. Although the long-range radar stations in the east of the country see the Russians coming a mile off, there's nothing they can do. The jets are on top of them almost immediately, heading straight for the LTAF airbase in Šiauliai. Russia has 2 primary goals and 2 secondary objectives. First, it seeks to take Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, near its border, before NATO can respond. Second, it will aim to seize land between Belarus and Poland, slowing NATO land defenses. Then, if it can conquer all 3 Baltic states without triggering nuclear war, it will have significant access to the Baltic and a much greater barrier between itself and NATO advances. And finally, even if it all comes to naught, Putin will learn an awful lot about how NATO conducts war. Lithuania's intelligence division, the VSD, has expected this move for some time. After all, why else would an openly threatening country line its troops up on the border? However, Lithuania's pleas for assistance to NATO allies have previously been swept under the rug. Nobody else believed Russia would start another war, especially considering its ongoing losses in Ukraine. How wrong they were. Hour 1. The attack has been strategically timed. Almost all NATO leaders around the world are asleep or preparing for bed. Only the American president and Canadian prime minister are still awake, but they're enjoying rare peaceful evenings with their families. But intelligence operatives are wide awake. All around the world, NATO leaders are urgently roused from their slumber and immediately summoned to high-security meetings. They're informed of Russia's invasion. The British Prime Minister, French President, and German Chancellor sleepily try to grasp the severity of the situation. At the same time, their 2 North American counterparts hold their heads in their hands. The world is on the brink of war, and Article 5 of the NATO agreement forces their retaliation, along with 26 other countries, and of course, Lithuania itself. But legal obligations aside, is an aggressive retaliation a plausible response? Will it save lives? Or most crucially of all, will it risk triggering an all-out nuclear war, mutually assured destruction of all major powers, and millions of unnecessary casualties? The NATO Response Force, the NRF, and its 40,000 troops are primed and ready to respond. They've been training for this and know that NATO can quickly mobilize a further 300,000 soldiers, with millions more prepared to be called up. But it needs the go-ahead. It can't act without authorization from the top. And the NATO leaders have a dilemma. NATO was implemented to deter Soviet expansion and aggression, seeking to prevent conflict. Now the war has started anyway. They face an unprecedented situation. How should they respond? Hour 2. NATO negotiators immediately try to open communication channels with the Kremlin. They're deeply concerned about the risk of worldwide nuclear war and outright destruction, but nobody answers. And because nobody answers, NATO leaders are at a loss for what to do. In fact, in Russia, Putin and his generals are purposefully ignoring the ringing red hotline, waiting to see how the West will respond. What move will they make? Until such time, they'll continue with the invasion as planned. Meanwhile, as dawn approaches, odd things start happening in industries throughout Lithuania and its Baltic state neighbors Estonia and Latvia. Breakers in power substations around the countries start mysteriously flipping off, bank networks go offline, port gates stop working, and strange messages appear on the phones of government officials and contractors. Before long, the vast majority of computers display nothing more than a black screen and a ransom message demanding Bitcoin payment. On the surface, it looks like an independent extortionist hacking group, but the strategic timing leaves few in doubt. Russia's elite hackers, such as the elusive GRU group known as Sandworm, are almost certainly behind the carnage. As Lithuanians wake up in a war, they find their heating and air conditioning systems offline. No matter, they've survived far more than the relatively mild discomfort caused by a spring attack on infrastructure like this, but they soon find it's far more than their systems. Most of the power remains out, preventing streetlights from working, electric cars from charging, and shops from opening. Even more dangerously, software helping the armed forces direct their personnel and organize strategic moves is utterly destroyed, along with all its backups. Its leaders and soldiers are resilient though. They turn to less conventional methods to facilitate communication. These include WhatsApp communications through satellite Wi-Fi and even runners carrying notes to and fro. Hour 3. Lithuanian forces continue to engage the Russian onslaught, but there's very little they can do without NATO support. Brave soldiers take out Russians at a ratio of more than 5-1. Still, the relentless wave of humans and machinery just keeps coming. Eventually, the self-sacrificial defenders are forced to fall back or risk being overwhelmed and wiped out. Where are its allies? Where is NATO? NATO is deliberating. European leaders are by now wide awake and beginning to plan countermeasures. Despite the encroaching night, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau in North America down strong coffees and continue to work. Here's the broader situation. Britain and France, two of the strongest European powers, have nuclear weapons of their own. Other countries, including Germany, Italy, and Belgium, have American nukes stationed within their borders. They're all poised and ready to fire them if necessary, but doing so would have catastrophic consequences. Despite Russia's significant losses of personnel and equipment in Ukraine and now Lithuania, it still maintains the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, with 5,580 warheads as of 2024. Of these, 1,710 are deployed and ready to be launched on a missile or loaded onto a bomber at a moment's notice. The world's other nuclear superpower, the US, held 3,708 as of 2023, with 1,419 deployed. In contrast, the world's other nuclear powers hold relatively meager numbers. Again, in 2023, China had 410, the UK had 225, France held 290, Pakistan had 170, India 164, Israel 90, and North Korea about 30. While these numbers may pale in comparison, especially considering that most are likely not actively deployed, note that modern nuclear weapons are often 50 to 100 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. If just one hits its intended target, the damage would be unfathomable, too great for the human brain to even comprehend. That's why NATO is carefully considering its next move. Russia is unpredictable right now, testing the waters and seeing what it can get away with. It's looking for a fight, but it doesn't have a death wish. NATO leaders, and most importantly the US, must choose their play carefully. The discussions are tense and drag on. All the while, Lithuanian soldiers are being pushed further and further back, with ground forces entering the outskirts of Vilnius. The tragic deaths are mounting. Hour 4. NATO boffins have been working away at the Russian cyber attack, isolating and reverse engineering the malware. Whoever is behind it is a genius. The destructive code has been a ticking time bomb, isolating unknown weaknesses in Windows operating systems and using these to spread through local networks. At the invasion's preset date, which must have been in the minds of Russian military planners for months, the malware code ran, wiping all the data in its path. While the Baltic states aren't the only ones affected, the bulk of the operational damage is concentrated in these areas. With NATO's help, the Lithuanians bring some power systems back online. It was a temporary handicap, but one which was extremely costly. As Lithuanian forces fall back, their communication systems come back online. This, combined with the never-say-die attitude of its armed forces, turned the battle towards guerrilla tactics. This begins to have a devastating morale impact on Russian troops, who are seeing their comrades killed in huge numbers all around them. Like the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians use their knowledge of the terrain and their force of mind to slow the Russian advance, proving particularly effective against the old and cumbersome tanks. Meanwhile, relatively safe in their comfortable meeting places throughout Europe and North America, the US finally decides what to do. Its fellow member states agree and turn to the job at hand with grim determination. NATO will reinforce Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia with troops, tanks, aircraft, ships, submarines, missiles, and missile defense systems. The overwhelming number and the quality of the individual units and troops should prove more than a match for Russia. However, NATO allocates the US to contact the Russians, explaining in clear terms that nuclear weapons are not on the table. Not yet, anyway. With their forces already gathered and ready, NATO sends supplies, armaments, and response force troops to the Baltic states. Countries begin mobilizing their standing armies and calling volunteers to enlist. The European navies, notably Britain and France, aren't what they once were. They must wait for reinforcement from the Italians, while the far more extensive American fleet begins the journey to join them. In the meantime, the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, the final iteration of the nuclear-powered Nimitz-class vessels with its FA-18 Super Hornets and E-2 Hawkeyes, is already in the area, despite usually being part of Carrier Strike Group 5 operating in the Indo-Pacific. NATO can respond quickly. However, one question remains: will they reach the Lithuanians in time? Day 2. The fighting rages on all day before nighttime brings a brief reprieve for most. Special forces operations from Lithuania, NATO, and Russia continue to penetrate across the lines in both directions, springing devastating surprise attacks and assassinations, but the battle lines, just outside Vilnius, hold relatively steady. It's looking good for Lithuania. Despite fierce resistance, the Russian forces simply keep on coming. Although the NATO alliance is on the way, there's little it can do to keep the onslaught at bay. Its leaders consult what to do. They know that every second the fighting continues, more men and women will die. But with ships, aircraft, and vehicles steamrolling in to reinforce them, they just need to hold out a bit longer. The decision is made that the sacrifice of the country's brave soldiers is worth it. If Russia takes the capital, they might never see independence again. By the second day, most power companies are back online, their systems restored from obscure backups. There are still a few glitches and areas where administrators struggle to bring industries back from cyber destruction, but still, things look far more positive than the previous day. Buildings in Vilnius are being flattened, with civilian deaths mounting. Artillery and missile fire takes down critical infrastructure, including power stations, transformers, and even hospitals. The situation is dire. There's no support from the ground or the air. The tiny LTAF has been destroyed before it even left the asphalt. Meanwhile, NATO introduces even more official sanctions on Russia, hitting its economy hard. Without the vital trade, Russia notices the first signs of struggles. However, plenty more countries outside of NATO rely on Russian imports and exports, notably China, Iran, Belarus, and North Korea. Although their trade is significantly reduced and the stock markets take a hammering, Russian forces show no signs of slowing down. The Lithuanian armed forces are growing tired as the day draws to a close. Russian armaments continue to pour over the border in droves, missiles raining down. With the local missile defense systems completely overwhelmed, civilian deaths and infrastructure damage are rising exponentially. But as evening comes, the first signs of hope arrive. Fifth-generation jets land in neighboring Poland, ready to launch devastating counterattacks. Vehicle-borne missile launchers used for attack and defense arrive in neighboring countries and Lithuania. These immediately kick into action, significantly reducing the damage from the air and providing Russian jets and bombers with a substantially more complex adversary. Day 3. Throughout all this time, Russia has had a gaping hole, the Baltic Sea. With all of Scandinavia now in NATO, there are plenty of places from which Lithuania can be reinforced, and sea access to the country can be maintained. Russia's Baltic Sea fleet consists of only one traditional old Soviet submarine, Dimitrov. In fact, it's one of the oldest submarines in the entire Russian Navy. Despite about 2 frigates, 27 corvettes, and a few landing craft, the Baltic Sea fleet is hopelessly outdated and focused more on intelligence and troop movement than military might. Its one destroyer, the Sovremeny-class Nastoychevi, has been in repair since 2019. The Baltic Fleet simply hasn't been the priority next to, for example, the Black Sea Fleet or the Northern Fleet in the Arctic. At the start of the third day of the war, Russia contacts NATO. The combined fleets have reached distances at which they can engage. Heavy artillery begins raining down on Russian positions, and Russian naval bases in Kaliningrad are immediately overwhelmed. NATO naval forces are simply far greater in numbers and firepower. And it isn't just at sea that NATO begins to take the advantage, supporting its small member state. Missile launchers line up, keeping a significant distance from each other to ensure safety in isolation. Russian jets now have a considerable problem avoiding missiles from the advanced Patriot missile defense systems. Almost all Russian missiles are now being intercepted, and Lithuania and NATO begin counterstrikes on Russian-held positions and reinforcement points. NATO jets join in, pounding targets relentlessly. Russia's air defense systems are put to work, but as time passes, NATO missiles are being constantly resupplied, and fifth-generation fighters with enhanced missile evasion capabilities keep coming. Russia, on the other hand, has a limited supply of both missiles and jets, and it can't afford to significantly reduce its stock or needlessly expend its hypersonic missiles or fifth-generation fighters in case of a more impactful future conflict. It's time to talk. Negotiations begin, but in the meantime the fighting continues. Putin is determined to learn as much about his enemy as he can. Likewise, NATO troops fight with renewed resolve for a free Lithuania. Although most NATO leaders are now confident in victory, they aren't sure yet when that will come around, nor the total cost of the war once arms are laid down. Week 2. As the war drags into its second week, the tide decisively turns in NATO's favor. Superior numbers and superior quality in those numbers mean that NATO armies have a massive advantage. F-35C aircraft from aircraft carriers dominate Russian-held positions, backed up by Europe's favored Eurofighter Typhoons. With footholds and FOBs established throughout Poland, Estonia, and Latvia, they pound Russian forces from the north and south, reinforcing in swarms. Naval bases in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark allow Allied ships to repeatedly dock, resupply, and come back at the trapped Russian forces, decimating their Baltic Sea fleet and honing in on Kaliningrad, Russia's main seaport. With the Danes controlling access to the Baltic Sea from the north, Russia has virtually no chance of breaking out. Their only hope is to surrender or fight alongside attacks on harbors or logistics chains. Fortunately for Russia, cyber attacks are its specialty. Government hackers launch a barrage of distributed denial of service and malware probes toward the Scandinavian-owned NATO ports. They have some initial success, with dock workers and sailors becoming confused and losing access to schedules and cargo information. This leads to long lines of ships stretching out into the sea, and these NATO vessels are vulnerable to attack. Russian missiles, jets, and their naval fleet turn to attack the ships and succeed in doing critical damage to a couple, but they're overwhelmed and forced to retreat by the hastily assembled escort warships. Cyber attacks can bring an immense temporary advantage. However, cybersecurity experts usually find a way to restore backed-up data or work around the malware within a few days, sometimes a few hours. In this case, NATO cybersecurity experts have the port systems back online and up to date in a few hours. It takes only a couple of days for the dock workers working overtime to get back on track. As Russia is pushed further and further back, things appear increasingly gloomy. Month 2. Russia begins to consolidate its forces. Putin knows he's not going to make any further progress against NATO and rallies all his troops back across the Russian border. But there's one last move in the book, and one that shakes Biden, Sunak, Scholz, Macron, Trudeau, and the rest of the NATO leaders to their core. Intelligence suggests that nuclear weapons are being prepped for launch in Kaliningrad and South Belarus. With no other option, NATO quickly decides it must act, preparing nuclear warhead-tipped Tomahawk missiles. Although Russia still has plenty of missiles, the invasion of Lithuania was never intended as a territorial expansion or a declaration of war on the rest of NATO. Russian leaders would never take such outrageous action, not without good reason to believe in their success at least. No, instead the Lithuanian invasion was always very likely to fail. It was always going to end up as a test, a sort of tragic live-fire exercise, a test of Russia's capabilities, an examination of how NATO would respond. Would nuclear weapons be on the table? Would the states get involved? Or would it refuse to risk escalating the conflict further? Russia hasn't gained any military ground or established any footholds. It will soon inevitably be forced to retreat, and yet that's what Putin and his leaders always expected would happen. In fact, they're fascinated by how the events have played out. NATO countries were far more willing to reinforce Lithuania than many in the war cabinet had imagined. Equally, the initial response from NATO was fraught with confusion, hesitation, and a hint of panic. Even as NATO missiles pound down, decimating their forces, Russia feels a gleam of satisfaction. It's learned a lot. It doesn't take long for the surrender and peace agreement to be reached, in which Russia promises never to invade again and pay for the damages sustained to Lithuania and the NATO forces. Putin and his government smile. They lost the battle, decidedly, but next time things might be different. What do you think a war between NATO and Russia would look like? Who would come out on top and why? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out if the US and China go to war, who loses hour by hour? Or click this other video instead. Is the draft coming back to a country near you, or even to the one you're living in? The war in Ukraine has revealed many new things about war, such as the importance of drones in the air and at sea, but it's also shown us that war hasn't changed as much as we think. The conflict has often resembled World War I. Trench warfare and indiscriminate artillery bombardments have been commonplace, but the resemblances go far beyond the battlefield. One of these is the slow but steady return of the military draft. How has the draft returned to Russia and Ukraine, and will the trend spread even further west? Might you be about to find yourself conscripted into your country's armed forces? In this video, we'll look for some answers. Other than Russia, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, with an area of about 233,000 square miles. In late 2021 and early 2022, Russia amassed about 190,000 troops on Ukraine's borders and invaded on the 24th of February along 4 fronts: in the northwest through Belarus toward the capital of Kyiv, in the south outward from Crimea, in the east through the unrecognized Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and in the northeast towards Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. Unfortunately for the Russians, this was not the quick, decisive war that they and their Western opponents expected. Aside from the logistical incompetence, poor morale, and poor doctrine, Russia's failures came from a seemingly simple origin. It did not have enough troops to subdue such a vast territory. After Ukraine defeated Russia's attempt to capture its capital, ended the threat to Kharkiv, and pushed the Russians out of Kherson and back across the Dnieper River, Vladimir Putin saw the writing on the wall. He issued a partial mobilization order, bringing 300,000 reservists back into active duty. He needed more men, pure and simple. Although Russia has suffered significantly more casualties than Ukraine, the latter's numerical disadvantage has begun to show more forcefully in the first half of 2024. The struggle of Ukraine's counteroffensive last year proved costly for its war effort. Even soldiers who have not become casualties have been in combat with little or no relief for over 2 years. Like their Russian enemies, Ukraine needed more men. The demand for additional troops has forced the country's legislature to overhaul its draft laws. Volunteers have dried up as the grim reality of prolonged attritional warfare has set in, and Ukraine's top brass have been reduced to pleading for more troops. In April, the Ukrainian legislature lowered the minimum draft age to 25 and increased penalties for draft dodging, as thousands of men in the country have already done. Ukraine even took a page out of Russia's playbook and allowed some prison inmates to serve. Women in Ukraine are not subject to these conscription laws, but in 2021, anticipating invasion, Ukraine opened the door to drafting women. Women in less specialized professions were forced to register with the Ukrainian military for possible service. However, these new changes might not be enough. Ukraine's commander in the Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Luhansk part of the front, General Yuri Sodol, claimed that Russian forces were outnumbering his troops by 7 to 10 times during the debate over the new draft law. This may have been an exaggeration to ensure the law's passage, but Ukraine's lack of manpower has proven a big problem in the latest campaigns of the war. The war is unlikely to end anytime soon. Consequently, the demand for manpower will go on. Don't be surprised if Ukraine comes out with a new draft law lowering the age of eligible men further, or even that it starts selecting the women who have registered for military service. Much attention has been paid to the new instruments of war, like drones. The rapid depletion of ammunition in a peer or near-peer conflict has also gotten a lot of attention, reminding Western countries that their industry and economies are unprepared for a high-intensity war. However, the war in Ukraine has also proven that boots on the ground matter just as much on the battlefield as it ever did. Technology might have advanced, but there's no substitute for having a lot of soldiers. This is another big problem for the West and like-minded countries. Dictators like Putin can easily call up necessary men and avoid accountability, especially if they force a disproportionate share of the burden on their country's least well-off population, as he has done with Russia's ethnic minorities. Western democracies cannot do this in the same way. Drafts require a significant level of public support. After the end of the Cold War, these countries mostly abandoned conscription and created smaller and fully professional armed forces. The most consequential NATO member that still uses mass conscription for a significant part of its military is Turkey. This is partly why it has the second largest active military in NATO, with about 335,000 active personnel and 379,000 in reserve, plus an additional 150,000 paramilitary forces. Turkey's traditional system of service involves mandatory 6 months of time spent in the ranks for all men between the ages of 19 and 40. However, Turkey's armed forces have become increasingly professionalized since the early 2010s. This change has permitted Turkish troops to conduct longer deployments further afield. The presence of a system of conscription, though, ensures that Turkey has a readily available source of manpower to call upon and a reliable way to ensure that its mobilized troops come to the colors in the event of conflict. The same is not the case for most of NATO's other members. Europe had once pioneered conscription, with the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon acting as the origin of the modern practice. France had the largest population in Europe at the time, and these conscripted armies, which started on shaky foundations but became battle-hardened and well-trained forces by the end of the period, overwhelmed the old systems of military recruitment seen in places like Russia, Prussia, and Austria. As the 19th century continued, France's old enemies adopted similar draft methods and legislation, so that by the time World War I came around, the only major Western powers that still relied on all-volunteer armies were the United Kingdom and the United States. The draft laws varied from nation to nation, but the principle that a country's able-bodied civilian male population would be subject to service in the national military became established. Germany was one of the leading examples. It had a system that required all able-bodied men who had reached the age of 20 to do 2 or 3 years of service in the active army. Once this was over, the men could return to civilian life, but remained on the rolls as reserves, subject to be called to active duty again until they reached the age of 45. In this way, Germany was able to raise its army from a force of 800,000 men to 3.5 million in only 12 days in 1914. Germany's detailed war planning and ability to mobilize its troops rapidly surprised and nearly overwhelmed its enemies, even though most of them had drafts as well. As the reality of modern industrial warfare became apparent, the United Kingdom was forced to institute a draft starting in 1916. The British High Command realized that it was no longer possible to rely on an all-volunteer military. The United States went through a similar experience during its Civil War. By early 1863, when it became apparent that the war would not be decided by a single dramatic battle, but through long years of attrition, the Congress passed the Enrollment Act, the first true military draft in American history. The United States did the same thing when it entered World War I. In 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service System into law, requiring all American men between ages 21 and 30 to register for military service. The law was amended the following year and extended eligibility for service to 45. World War II saw much the same results, with Germany using conscription to swell its ranks into the millions and its enemies having to institute much more onerous drafts in response. For example, in the First World War, Britain made room for conscientious objectors, but this was largely not the case in the Second. The United States began to abandon the draft once the Vietnam War proved highly unpopular. In January 1973, the Selective Service Board announced that there would be no further draft calls. This followed a campaign promise President Nixon made to end the draft in 1968. His landslide re-election in 1972 gave him more political capital to follow through on the promise. Ever since, the United States military has become a professional fighting force, with volunteer and often career soldiers. Today, the United States has a standing army of 1.3 million active personnel, with an additional 800,000 in reserve. However, this is less than 1% of the American population. Most Americans have no military experience or expectation that they could be drafted, and this could prove a serious problem in a modern war. European countries, too, gradually abandoned their drafts following the end of World War II. Despite Cold War-era tensions, a long period of peace on the continent prevailed. European nations, by and large, continued to spend over 2% of their GDP on defense, but they began to reassess their draft laws. Britain ended its draft in 1960. As the war in Ukraine continues, though, some British officials have recently dared to introduce the idea of a renewed draft in the public consciousness. Sir Patrick Sanders, the highest-ranking officer in the British Army, made waves in January 2024 when he said that the British public would need to be prepared to take up arms against Vladimir Putin's Russia in the event of a wider war in Europe. Italy has also made waves with the prospect of a reintroduced draft. The country abolished all forms of compulsory military service in 2004, but the invasion of Ukraine is changing those calculations. Giorgia Meloni's government is in the midst of a significant rearmament program, and recently, Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini suggested that conscription may need to be a part of it. His party plans to reintroduce a conscription bill in the country's legislature. If enacted, there will be 6 months of compulsory military service for men and women alike. 10 Downing Street was quick to distance itself from General Sanders' comments. Italy, too, has not made any concrete plans to reintroduce a draft, as it's likely that Salvini's bill will be defeated. For now, the British and Italian public would find such moves unacceptable because they are still far away from the Russian threat. Other countries do not have the same luxury. Germany, the leading power in Europe, but which has been notoriously negligent in its military preparedness, has slowly changed its tune since the invasion. A mere 3 days after Russia attacked Ukraine, Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced that Berlin would meet the NATO benchmark to spend 2% on defense and create a modern military capable of defending Germany from Putin's aggressions. The problem is that in addition to a lack of industrial capacity due to years of low spending, it's become apparent in Berlin that the modern method of recruiting soldiers would not raise the necessary forces in the event of a conflict. Germany was the center of Cold War tensions, the area likeliest to suffer the worst in the event of a Third World War. While it's not as vulnerable today, NATO still considers it under enough of a threat that preparing to defend it was one of the most important parts of the Steadfast Defender 2024 exercise, the largest the alliance undertook since the fall of the Soviet Union. Germany ended conscription in 2011, but has begun to take a second look. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has tasked his ministry with exploring the potential draft options, and in May 2024, Scholz said in a press conference that Germany needed to find ways to convince more people to find careers in the military. The opposition party, the Christian Democrats, have gone further and announced their intentions to reintroduce the draft in Germany if their party wins the country's national election next year. Germany's plans are therefore more advanced than Britain's and Italy's. Unsurprisingly, the trend seems to be proportional with the threat each country faces. France is well buffered from renewed Russian aggression thanks to its geography, but President Macron has long been one of the voices warning that Europe needed a credible defense, independent of the United States and its chaotic domestic politics. France ended its draft in 1997, but even in the 2000s, policymakers in Paris began to realize that their country was unacceptably vulnerable. France's projects Scorpion, Titan, and Vulcan have meant to shore up supplies of military equipment and ensure reliable manufacturing at scale. Once these initiatives were in place, French policymakers turned their attention toward the supply of manpower. As early as 2018, Macron brought back mandatory national service, although this did not necessarily mean military service. Nevertheless, he gave away his intentions the previous year during a campaign speech. There he praised the virtues of a military life and its ability to bring renewed social cohesion. He implied such service would only be for a month if it was reintroduced. Now things are much more explicit. Several departments in France toyed with the idea of renewed conscription in 2023. Macron was also considering proposals. Nothing has come to fruition yet, but France seems to be one of the likeliest countries to reintroduce its draft in relatively short order. Aside from the Baltic states, Romania might be the most vulnerable country in NATO. It abolished its draft in 2007, but since it borders Ukraine, it will be on the front lines of any renewed conflict with Russia. It's already had a preview, as Russia launched drone attacks on Ukrainian ships carrying grain on the Danube as an alternative to the dangerous Black Sea shipping route. Some explosions reportedly took place on Romanian territory. Romania also has Serbia for a neighbor, which is a friendly country to Russia, and has also made serious overtures of bringing back conscription in its borders. Additionally, the low pay in the Romanian military, less than $1,100 per month for non-commissioned officers and even lower for privates, makes voluntary recruiting even more difficult. In light of these realities, Romanian Prime Minister Nicolae Ciucă floated the idea of bringing conscription back in 2023. His speech highlighted a growing realization among European leaders in general. Back onto the drawing board comes the defense industry, needing to be turned into war industry, and so do the small, technologically sophisticated armies of professionals that must revert to mass armies with society-wide reserves and extensive mobilization capabilities to cope with a large-scale, long, high-intensity, and resource-depleting warfare. Ciucă is a former general in Romania's armed forces, so he understands the delicate situation better than most. Romania is one of the NATO countries spending above 2% of GDP on defense, reaching 2.5% in 2023, but it would have serious manpower issues if it did not reintroduce conscription, manpower issues which have already proven so dangerous over the course of the war next door. Like Britain and Italy, Romania has not yet made a serious attempt to reintroduce conscription, though it wouldn't be surprising if it did. 15 countries in Europe still have drafts, although not all of them are serious about conscription. For example, the Netherlands does not enforce its draft laws. Its relatively safe position has given its politicians cover to not be serious about it. Lithuania is a different story. It's one of the countries at the highest risk of a Russian invasion. It abolished its draft in 2008, but reinstated it in 2016 after Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for the breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine 2 years earlier. Given their historical experience, the Lithuanians caught on to what Russia was up to, and Vilnius reinstituted its draft to cope with the increased threat. Under the current law, Lithuanian men between the ages of 18 and 23 may be called to serve in the armed forces for a stint of 9 months and are selected randomly through an electronic lottery. 27,000 men are currently in this lottery. Estonia, another of the Baltic states, also maintains conscription, with all men being required to serve 11 months under the colours. Sweden abolished its draft in 2010, but this lasted for only 7 years. Stockholm reintroduced conscription after Vladimir Putin's aims in Europe became apparent. The draft is less strict than other countries, as Sweden sends notice to both men and women of military age, asking them if they think they will be a good fit for military service. Those that answer no don't have an obligation to serve. Stockholm claims it only wants to call up people that are motivated. Those that do serve stay between 9 and 12 months. If the Russian threat continues to grow, don't be surprised if Sweden becomes less accommodating with those that do not wish to serve. Norway shares a border with Russia, which is why it never abolished conscription. In 2013, conscription was extended to women, making it the first NATO member to do so. All able-bodied people between the ages of 18 and 44 are expected to serve for 12 months. In wartime, the eligibility pool rises to the age of 55. This model is one that countries like France and Germany see as potentially being ideal, which means that if they were to bring back their drafts, women would likely be involved. In Europe, the trend seems to be a slow and steady return of conscription. If the situation in Ukraine gets worse, don't be surprised if those dominoes start to fall, as they have through the history of the European continent. In the United States, policymakers have floated a return of the draft, but while the selective service system remains in place and all men must register with it upon their 18th birthdays, no serious prospect of a reintroduced draft has made any headway. The all-volunteer military was more than adequate to face down the Soviet Union in its last days, and the era of American hegemony that followed. However, with Washington pressured in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, the demand for more soldiers is likely to increase in coming years, and in the event of a war, America would likely be involved on at least 2 far-flung fronts, just as in World War II. The current size of the United States military would be inadequate for this mission. That remains theoretical, but one thing is certain. Momentum is building to reintroduce conscription in many of the countries that thought it would be gone forever. Depletion of men in a peer or near-peer conflict is as serious as depletion of ammunition, leaving national leaders with no choice but to retool their populations just as much as they have tried to do with their industries. When commenting on the potential need for renewed conscription, General Sanders said that regular armies start wars, citizen armies win them. This was the case in both world wars, and it's proving the case in Ukraine today. When wars are not brought to a quick and decisive conclusion, the old professional army depletes quickly from attrition, and conscripted replacements are needed rapidly. This was something that much of the world had conveniently forgotten during the era of the so-called end of history and the focus on low-level counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency operations. Now that great power competition is returning and that the world is shifting into separate ideological camps, history is rearing its head again. The draft has already returned to a few countries in the West. Do you think their allies will follow suit? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out If NATO and Russia Go to War, Who Loses, Hour by Hour, or click this other video instead. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and NATO has hit its lowest point since the fall of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the recent accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO has mostly cut off Russia from accessing the Baltic Sea, apart from the few northern ports and the Kaliningrad Oblast, which has frequently been called one of Russia's main strategic weak points in recent history. But throughout these conflicted times when Russia is struggling to maintain positive relations with countries around the world, it's managed to carve out alliances with some nations that have allowed it to support its war economy, at least in the short term. This was primarily due to China stepping up to replace the EU as Russia's biggest trading partner for oil and natural gas, even if the price that Russia is getting on the Chinese market is much lower than the EU used to pay. However, Russia is not only looking to the east to solve its economic and geopolitical issues. In fact, a tiny island to its north could give Russia the upper hand in its battle with NATO. Recent developments, particularly those regarding global warming, have made Russia more optimistic about controlling the Arctic Circle. But why? You see, while the bulk of international trade between North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia uses the Suez Canal, or in some circumstances the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, there are 2 other, lesser-known maritime sea routes. These are the Arctic routes, one off the coast of Russia called the Northeast Passage, and the other off the coast of Canada called the Northwest Passage. Both curve around the North Pole. The Northeast Passage holds the Northern Sea Route, the bulk of which passes through Russian-controlled waters off the coast of Siberia and the Far East. The Northern Sea Route has been repeatedly proposed as an alternative to the traditional shipping route via the Suez and Malacca Strait, since it takes roughly 40% less time to traverse during summertime. However, the Northern Sea Route has 2 major issues. First, the route is frequently icebound during the winter months, meaning that trading vessels typically need an icebreaker entourage to be able to make it through the Arctic Circle. Secondly, while the most western end of the route is in Norway-controlled waters, Russia controls the other parts on the Northern Sea Route. Specifically, the small island, technically an archipelago, of Svalbard could prove pivotal in future NATO-Russia relations. Svalbard is an archipelago spanning some 24,000 square miles, about the size of Croatia, lying midway between mainland Norway and the North Pole. The archipelago's largest city and administrative center is roughly 520 miles away from the Norwegian mainland. Svalbard is a somewhat unique case in global geopolitics, as it's a territory that is governed by Norway, but Norway technically doesn't own it. As such, the archipelago is not part of the Schengen area or the European Economic Area. Instead, the archipelago has special requirements on who can enter and stay there permanently. While there are no limits based on the nationalities of the residents, a vast majority of them are between 25 and 44 years old. Additionally, the archipelago has technically forbidden people from being buried on its grounds. Instead, people with terminal illnesses are advised to leave the island so they can die elsewhere. This is due to Svalbard being positioned in an area with permafrost, which prevents bodies from decomposing and allows them to spread diseases into the environment. The main reason why the island's administration has diverged so much from Norwegian control is the Svalbard Treaty from 1920. Originally, 3 countries held significant interest in the archipelago: Norway, Sweden, and the Russian Empire. However, talks about jointly governing the islands during the early years of the 20th century came to a halt with the Russian Revolution and the onset of World War I. Following the war, revolutionist Russia was temporarily more interested in resolving its own internal issues than following up on Svalbard. This led to Norway and Sweden to sign the Spitsbergen Treaty without Russia, enacting policies similar to what's in place today. The Russian Empire eventually signed onto the treaty itself. The then Foreign Minister of Russia claimed that the treaty should be thrown in the trash and that Bear Island belongs to Russia. The Foreign Minister was referencing Bear Island, the southernmost island of the archipelago, roughly 2/3 of the way between the region's administrative center and mainland Norway. The small island was long considered a separate entity from Svalbard, but was included with it during the talks in the treaty and its administration given to Norway. While the treaty also allows for visa-free travel and stays in Svalbard, with specific circumstances such as proof of employment on the island, there have also been instances where Russian diplomats who were barred from entering the EU were also restricted from going to Svalbard. Although it has an international community, a few towns in the archipelago hold significant Russian native populations. This is primarily due to Russia owning mineral mines on the islands, which were bought from Norway in the mid-20th century. The Russian communities that were built surrounding the mines have typically waned and towns abandoned. However, the largest mining towns of Pyramiden, now abandoned, and Barentsburg, the second largest settlement on the archipelago with a population of roughly 450, are still vital to Russia's international interests. Pyramiden is primarily designed as a tourist attraction, containing the northernmost bust of Lenin in the world. Barentsburg still contains an integrated Russian community and is a source of coal for northern European countries and Russia. Before Russia connected the northern cities of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk to the more popular centers such as Moscow and St. Petersburg via trains, coal from Svalbard was the primary way these northern cities generated energy and powered their industries. The cities are also vital as some of Russia's largest and most populous ports on the Arctic Ocean. Additionally, the Kola Peninsula, the northwesternmost part of Russia, contains several nuclear weapon sites and military bases, making it of utmost importance for Russian military strategies. As a result, during the 20th century, Russia invested significant funds into keeping the mining settlements in Svalbard prosperous, which in turn propped up the industry and military complexes on its mainland. Svalbard is also considered pivotal in Russia's attempts to control the Arctic Ocean. Without direct control over Svalbard, the Arctic coast of Russia and its military bases would be easy pickings for NATO offensives that use northern Norway or Svalbard itself as a supply point. To get around this point of contention, the Spitsbergen Treaty also forbids all military presence on the Svalbard archipelago, preventing any country that has a claim on the island from establishing bases or even performing military drills and exercises in surrounding waters. However, Norway, as its governing entity, often patrols the archipelago with Coast Guard vessels. Ostensibly, this is part of the Norwegian efforts to ensure that Svalbard remains free from permanent military setups and a big part of projecting control over the islands. Additionally, Norway has also instituted border regimes where Russian citizens who were forbidden from entering the EU, such as expelled diplomats, were also prevented from traveling to the archipelago. This came to a head in 2015, when then Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin visited the island. Norway responded by further tightening the visa regime for Russian citizens to the archipelago and threatened them with deportations. Russia hasn't taken kindly to the fact that Norway has seemingly free rein to parade its vessels so close to the Russian Arctic ports, nor with it tightening visa requirements for its citizens. Russia considered these moves as antithetical to the treaty. In fact, they also expressed similar concerns during the actual signing in 1935, as mentioned before. Norway argues that the presence of its coastal guard vessels isn't a warlike stance and thus completely obeys the Svalbard Treaty. Russia has also complained about the Norwegian satellite base located on the island, among the largest satellite bases in the world and which provides ground services to multiple satellite companies. Russia asserted that the satellites were being used for military purposes, which Norway has vehemently denied every time and manifested its obligations as outlined in the treaty. Another country that has also shown interest in Svalbard is China. The country has raised concerns over whether the research settlements on the archipelago, particularly Ny-Ålesund to the north, are properly allowing for the creation of a truly international community. On the surface, this might seem like an innocuous issue. However, China has been more involved in the geopolitics surrounding the Arctic Circle in recent years, particularly with regard to their rights and interests in the region. The country has an Arctic policy from 2018, which invokes the Svalbard Treaty 6 times in an attempt to legitimize the Chinese rights on policies surrounding the Arctic, even though the area is far away and completely detached from China's international waters or holdings. China operates a few research teams on Svalbard, but its goal seems to be to use this presence to further legitimize itself as a near-Arctic state and carve a piece of geopolitical influence that surrounds the Arctic region. If you're wondering why we seem to suddenly switch to China in a NATO-Russia conversation, the reason is quite simple. Over the course of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China and Russia have announced a potentially unending partnership and alliance bolstered by shared values and trade deals between the countries. China is ostensibly using Russia's access to the Northern Sea route in an attempt to shore up one of its significant weaknesses to the south, the Malacca Strait. Both the US and India, two of China's largest rival economies and militaries in the world, maintain a stranglehold on that strait and are thus potentially able to control the trade that passes through it. Currently, the Malacca Strait is responsible for more than 60% of maritime trade coming into China, particularly natural resources. A US blockade of the strait would severely limit China's ability to maintain its industry-based economy. As such, China, in a push for more rights and freedoms through the Arctic, could bypass a potential Malacca blockade and allow itself to retain its influence over Western Europe by creating a more lucrative trade route through the Northern Sea route. Since China and Russia are embroiled in an alliance, it's difficult to ascertain just how much of Russia's actions surrounding Svalbard are actually in service to China as one of its biggest trading partners and one of the reasons why it can sustain its war effort for so long. Apart from complaints about Norwegian jurisdictions and adherence to the Svalbard Treaty, there's an ongoing dispute over who controls the waters surrounding the archipelago. The draft of the treaty is ambiguous on the matter since the 200 nautical mile maritime zone surrounding the archipelago is never mentioned as belonging to a particular jurisdiction or administration. Previously, the entire region surrounding the Svalbard continental shelf has been under Norway's administration, which has raised issues in 2020 when Norway tried to debate fishing rights and quotas within Svalbard waters. While Norway maintains it's the only country with the right to fish in the waters surrounding Svalbard, Russia contends that the general rights given to all signatories of the treaty also include fishing rights in the waters. The ambiguity has led to Russia and China attempting to assert those rights and perform large-scale fishing operations in the Arctic. There have already been issues with Russian vessels operating in waters around Svalbard. In January 2022, a vital subsea cable laid in the ocean was found cut after an extensive fishing operation. Norway hasn't formally accused Russia of foul play, but many strategists speculate that Russia was behind the move. In hindsight, it could be argued that Russia actually cut the cable in an attempt to slow down NATO's information-gathering attempts, particularly considering the aforementioned satellite station on the archipelago. This is a particularly convincing argument when you realize that Russia would end up invading Ukraine roughly a month later. Additionally, the Nord Stream gas pipelines were sabotaged in September 2022, which exacerbated the issue surrounding Norway's national security and defense. While a conclusive perpetrator of these two events hasn't been established, Russia could argue that they are indicative of Norway being incapable of properly governing, controlling, and protecting its assets in the Arctic. Since Norway is the only country whose coastal guard is allowed to station itself on the archipelago, Russia is using this as an attempt to undermine Norway's authority in the region. Furthermore, Russia is also allowed to send fishing and research operations in the nearby Barents Sea, but the responsibility for assuring that Russia is not performing any illegal activities in the region lies solely on Norway's coastal guard. This places additional administrative pressure on Norway to funnel resources into governing the Arctic region. Russia refuses to allow Norway to fully control the area, as it doesn't believe that the treaty gives it the right to do so. Therefore, any actual inspections, blockades, or arrests of Russian vessels could be met with hostile Russian response, including military conflict. Additionally, recent developments between China and Russia regarding the Arctic complicate the strategic potential of the Kola Peninsula and the nearby Svalbard archipelago. While most countries that claimed maritime control zones in the Arctic were a part of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, all but Russia have suspended their membership in the forum following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In response, Russia invited China to become a member of the forum, a move that could be seen as an attempt by China to gain more leverage as a near-Arctic nation and further its own goals in the region. Russia and China have also signed an agreement on bolstering law enforcement operations in the Murmansk region. As we mentioned, the region is one of Russia's main nuclear weapons storage sites, so Russia considers the Northwest of utmost importance for force projection and military strength perception. China could also try to challenge Norway's administration on Svalbard and pursue a more significant presence surrounding the archipelago's economic and strategic situation. But what would happen if Russia decided to press into Svalbard militarily? Since it doesn't acknowledge the treaty as fair, Russia might consider the fact that Norway has a quasi-military presence close to the Kola Peninsula as threatening to its defensive operations. Russia can then deploy its Arctic fleet and test how NATO might respond to further actions. This could play out in several different ways. As a member of NATO, Norway is protected under the alliance's Article 5, but Svalbard technically doesn't fall under Norway's geographical territory. Furthermore, there have been dissenting views within NATO itself over which navy can ostensibly operate within Svalbard's waters. The US in particular has not been a part of the discussion of Norway's economic allowances surrounding the Svalbard region as they relate to fishing operations. Therefore, it's unclear whether it would consider Svalbard Norway's territory and invoke Article 5 if Russia does end up making an offensive move to annex the region, like it has done previously with Crimea and other parts of Ukraine. If the US doesn't consider Svalbard to be part of Norway, this could lead to a paradoxical situation where Norway's fleet would have to go against Russia alone, at least at first. However, the response from other NATO countries in Europe would likely be in support of Norway. As a result, Russia making an offensive move on Svalbard might spark an all-out war between NATO countries in Europe and Russia. It's a war that Russia might not be able to win. Add to that the fact that most countries in Europe have been actively working on increasing their defense spending and revitalizing their military presence, and Russia might be forced to abandon its plans of annexing the archipelago anytime soon. Its current invasion of Ukraine is another thorn in Russia's plans. Due to the war developing into a conflict of attrition, Russia's current economy is completely focused on improving the land-based portion of its military and conscription to further the war effort. Therefore, Russia might not have as many active resources to spend on the Arctic fleet, which would be the only real way to blockade or occupy the archipelago due to its remoteness. However, Russia has about 30% more military bases in the Arctic than NATO, and its Arctic fleet is still one of the largest in the world, with 11 nuclear submarines at its disposal. Meanwhile, although NATO has 22 nuclear subs, although these numbers were confirmed in 2018 and may be higher today, they are spread between France, the UK, and the US. NATO would have to actively take part in the conflict for this fleet to arrive to balance the scales. As a result, it's unclear whether Russia can actively seek to enforce its military supremacy over the Arctic or whether it's relegated to saber-rattling. In another scenario, Russia would likely bide its time by continuously trying to undermine Norway's authority over the region. With China's help, its Arctic strategy could revolve around trying to extract as much economic benefit from not only the archipelago itself, but also through the opening of the Northern Sea route. The same global warming issue that could spearhead trade over the Arctic Ocean could also make mining operations on the islands of Svalbard more manageable and profitable. Since Russia still owns mines on the island and has a moderate population there, its goal might be to try and relocate even more Russian nationals onto the island to bolster those settlements' economies. Over time, this could skew the balance of power and administration away from Norway and NATO and create internal pressure on the islands. In the worst case, this could result in a similar situation to what happened in Crimea in 2014. By gaining control over Svalbard, Russia would gain an immediate economic foothold in the region, a forward base for its military operations, and undermine NATO's authority over the Barents Sea. This would mean that the Russian Arctic fleet would have a clear route into the north of Europe. But what is NATO doing to counter this threat from Russia? As mentioned earlier, the accession of Finland and Sweden has made great strides in uniting European countries and closing off Russia from accessing European territory. Additionally, Sweden and Finland already likely have defensive and offensive measures put in place in a theoretical NATO-Russia war. Finland shares a significant land border with Russia, and Sweden is perhaps Russia's biggest maritime adversary in the northern section of the Baltic Sea. Additionally, the US administration under President Joe Biden has recognized that Russia can use the Arctic as a staging ground for a conflict with Europe, and that the Svalbard region has become both economically and strategically important for both sides. This means that the US is likely to finally enter the discussion of Norway's economic policies in Svalbard and try to create a unitary guideline or consensus over Svalbard's maritime zones. This would go a long way toward resolving the current issues between Norway and the EU over fishing rights in the region, which could, in turn, set up a precedent for Norway to be able to respond to Russian vessel activities. Additionally, the US could try to resolve whether Svalbard geographically falls in Norway's territory. If it does, then the archipelago would automatically gain protection from NATO via Article 5 of the alliance. This would ultimately prevent Russia from making any offensive moves on the region without heavy repercussions from all NATO countries. Currently, Russia is at a marked disadvantage since it doesn't have any allies that could threaten NATO directly. China is practically blockaded by the US and India controlling its main trading routes and is relying on ongoing investments into its Belt and Road Initiative to resolve some of those issues before it could attempt to gain some ground, figuratively and literally. That means that Russia would ultimately be up against the entire NATO alliance alone if it decides on an offensive action. The most likely result from that would be complete loss in the Ukrainian invasion, which has already siphoned significant resources and relocated parts of the permanent troop stations across the country, including in the Kola Peninsula. Due to the region's remoteness and administrative complexity, one of the best ways to resolve the issue might be for the US to enforce the complete removal and prevention of warlike military installments surrounding the archipelago. However, NATO would have to maintain a balance between that and allowing Norway to clearly exert its administrative powers over the region. To that end, the fact that Svalbard is still outside of the Schengen area and the European Economic Area adds another layer of friction between Russia, China, and NATO. NATO would likely need to pacify China by allowing research operations from the country to remain on the island. However, there need to be clear guidelines on what actions from China would encroach on Norway's and by extension NATO's governance of the area. This hard line in the sand, or in this case the snow, would be China and Russia trying to challenge and push on as they've previously done in Taiwan and Ukraine respectively. Ultimately, NATO needs to create a unified approach towards foreign actions on Svalbard and ratify the guidelines set up by the Svalbard Treaty, or possibly even sign a new one that is more precise and inclusive of the current geopolitical situation. But what do you think is most likely to happen with this small archipelago that's populated more by bears than humans? Will Russia try to leverage its alliance with China to gain a foothold in the area? Or will China's ambitions toward Taiwan outcompete those in the Arctic, ultimately leaving the matter unsettled? Leave a comment below and thank you for watching. If World War III were to break out today, where would the fire start? One of the likeliest scenarios involves the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These former members of the Soviet Union joined NATO and the European Union in 2004, and Vladimir Putin has been very unhappy about it ever since. In fact, he resented the independence of the Baltic states from the day they freed themselves from Moscow's grip. Now, with Russia gaining ground in Ukraine, albeit at a steep price, the Baltic states are even more of a hot spot in world politics than they were a year ago, as the Kremlin harbors secret annexation plans, much like it has with Belarus. And it's not out of the question that Russia will use less than peaceful means to bring them back into its fold. But why do these three tiny states matter so much that Putin may be willing to risk even further escalation with the West? Let's take a look and see why these three seemingly small countries are much more important than you might think, and why this area in northeastern Europe is one of the likeliest starting points for a World War III. By themselves, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania do not cut significant figures on the world stage. They have a combined population of only 6.1 million people. Their economies aren't large either, with Estonia ranking 97th in the world, Latvia ranking 95th, and Lithuania ranking 79th. However, despite their small size, they sit on vital real estate, making them geopolitical hotspots. The Baltic states are highly vulnerable. To the north lies Russian territory in St. Petersburg, to the south lies the heavily fortified Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. In addition to some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons, there are between 100,000 and 200,000 troops there, complete with long-range conventional missiles, artillery, and a vast electronic warfare network. To the east there is Russia's vassal state of Belarus. Starting in 2023, Russia deployed some of its tactical nuclear weapons there too, reactivating Cold War-era bases in Belarusian territory for this purpose. Russia has around 4,000 troops in Belarus, according to Ukrainian sources. However, there are an additional 20,000 troops on the border between Belarus and Russia as of January 2024. These troops could easily be deployed to invade Estonia and Latvia directly from Russian territory, or they could be sent through Belarus to attack Lithuania, particularly along the Suwalki Gap, NATO's most vulnerable geographic point. The Suwalki Gap is a 62-mile stretch of border between Poland and Lithuania. Belarus sits on the eastern end of this line, while Kaliningrad is to the west. This small but volatile piece of real estate came into the crosshairs in June 2022. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Lithuania announced that its national railway would prohibit certain goods leaving Kaliningrad to transit through its territory. These goods included coal, metal, and building materials, amounting to about 50% of the total commerce coming from Kaliningrad across the Suwalki Gap. Anton Alikhanov, the governor of Kaliningrad, responded by saying that Lithuania's move was a serious violation. A pincer operation along this narrow stretch of land would secure a long-desired land bridge to Kaliningrad from Russian territory and cut the Baltic states off from the rest of NATO by land. Russian forces would greatly outnumber the militaries of the Baltic states along this narrow front. Once the Suwalki Gap is secured, Russian forces in the south will be able to sweep northward to create another pincer on the Baltic states, with their comrades coming from Russian and Belarusian territory from the east. Russia has historically sought naturally defensible borders. Unfortunately for Moscow, because the country sits at the broadest part of the European plain, it's hard to acquire natural defensible frontiers. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia's border with NATO was about 766 miles. The entrance of Finland into the alliance in 2023 added 830 more miles of border to defend. Annexing the Baltic states would reduce this border by about 316 miles by removing the existing border with Estonia and Latvia. It would also give Russia a much more naturally defensible border, since it would now sit on the Baltic Sea. Defenses in the area could be linked up with the fortifications and garrisons in Kaliningrad thanks to the new land bridge. This would create a formidable defense network, acting as a severe threat to Poland and Finland. Russia would also reverse its fortunes in the Baltic Sea. Thanks to Sweden's recent entry into the alliance, the Baltic is now a NATO lake, with Russia left with only two small rumps of territory there, around Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg. This is a complete reversal of the situation that prevailed in the Cold War, where the Baltic was for all practical purposes a Soviet lake. In the event of a Russian annexation of the Baltic states, Russia will be able to project more power into the sea and restore a more favorable balance with NATO there. The Baltic Sea is one of the world's busiest shipping areas and vital to the economy of Europe. Roughly 15% of the world's maritime trade transits through these confined waters, including much of the trade in Russia's vital energy industry. Even now, a third of Russia's crude oil exports come in tankers, which move through the Baltic and past the Danish Straits. Before the invasion, all of Russia's oil exports through the Baltic went to Europe. Some of these exports still do, but the lion's share of them now go to Egypt, Turkey, India, and even China. Increased energy purchases from China, India, and Turkey in particular have proven vital in Russia's ability to stabilize its economy following the sanctions imposed by Western countries and their allies from February 2022 onward. Russia has avoided the worst and has been able to sustain its war effort thanks to these new relationships. However, its loss of nearly all power in the Baltic means that its trade remains vulnerable, and it now has almost no say in the course of commerce that goes through this narrow and busy area. Cutting off this trade would devastate Russia. Securing the Baltic states would not solve the issue of the Danish choke points, an issue which has haunted Russia throughout its history, but restoring balance in the sea is still vital for Moscow if it wants a more credible deterrent against NATO. Being able to threaten the shipping of NATO countries would help to keep its own maritime trade secure. But Putin is not interested in the Baltic states simply for strategic reasons. Above all, he is an ideological revanchist. He is famous for referring to the fall of the Soviet Union as a tragedy that reversed centuries of Russian territorial and cultural expansion. He further claimed that the Soviet Union's collapse separated the people of Russian ethnicity or cultural ties from their historical motherland. In his 2021 essay that most consider his justifications for the invasion of Ukraine, entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Putin argued that extreme Ukrainian nationalists sponsored by the Western powers were attempting to further separate the people of historical Russian civilization from one another, even enlisting neo-Nazi elements to do so. The large presence of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people within Ukraine's borders further lent to his arguments that Ukraine had not been a historical nation separate from Russia. Furthermore, he believed that these Russians needed protection from the radical elements sponsored by the West. Putin viewed Ukraine's internationally recognized borders as ahistorical constructions imposed on the world by the Western powers. Historians roundly dismissed his claims as propaganda, but he had power, and he nevertheless used it to invade Ukraine, whether he believed in his propaganda or not. This is bad news for the Baltic states, particularly Estonia and Latvia. 25% of their respective populations are composed of ethnic Russians. Lithuania's population is only 4.5% Russian, but it shares the historical experiences of its neighbors. All three of the Baltic states were annexed by the expanding Russian Empire in the 18th century. The three only declared their independence from Russian control in 1918, following Russia's defeat in World War I and the dissolution of the empire. The Soviet Union did not meekly accept this, however, and as a consequence of World War II, all of the Baltic states were put back under Moscow's control. Independence was regained from the weakening and fall of the Soviet Union. Lithuania declared its independence from Moscow again in 1990, even before the Soviet Union's end. Today, the Baltic states are heavily integrated into the economic and cultural spheres of the West. Their ethnic majorities view themselves as culturally Western, especially the generation born after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states are becoming more integrated with the West in other ways. One of the few remaining ties to the Russian sphere of influence is through their respective power grids. Following the Soviet Union's downfall, the Baltic states remained part of the same power grid with Russia and Belarus. All three are now in the midst of integrating their electrical networks with Europe and plan to leave the post-Soviet grid at the end of next year. Russia views this plan as a threat. In addition to these historical and strategic factors, there is another factor which may make the Baltic states even more of a hotspot: Russia's limited window of opportunity. Russia's fertility rate is 1.826 births per woman. This is up from the lows seen in the late 1990s and early 2000s, but still significantly below replacement level. Demographers predict that by the end of the century, Russia's population will fall from its current 144 million to 112 million. A falling population not only means fewer people, but an increase in a country's average and median ages. There will be fewer young people to serve in the military, keep the economy running, and create new products and innovations to spur growth in the future. This slow but steady demographic transition means that Russia is running out of time to regain the lost territories and people that were once part of the Empire or the Soviet Union. It need only look to its rival Ukraine to see a preview of its future. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers was between 30 and 35 when the war began, but has risen to 43 before the end of 2023. The age may get lower as Ukraine inevitably revises its draft laws to conscript younger people into the ranks, but this will not take away from the broader trend of aging soldiers. Similar data is not available for Russian soldiers, although they are thought to be a little younger on average than their Ukrainian counterparts. Nevertheless, those soldiers are old by the standards of most wars. In World War II, the average age of a soldier in the Red Army was likely in the early 20s based on casualty data. As Russia ages, it can expect to face similar problems in its military. It will also need to spend more money on elder care. Point being, if Russia wants to reclaim its imperial and Soviet borders and bring its ethnic, linguistic, and cultural diaspora back under Moscow's control, it must do so in relatively short order, before the effects of an aging population set in and it finds itself forced to return inward to deal with the problem. Russia's strategic partner China is facing a similar conundrum, which is why many national security officials in Washington fear an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine 2 years ago, much as it shook a world that had largely come to believe that conflict was a thing of the past, it's not surprising in this historical and demographic context. Like Germany before World War I, Russia and China are two aspirants to greater world power at the expense of the order created by the existing hegemon, in this case the United States, and like the German Empire, their relative power in the international system is now at a high point, with a decline coming. The fact that these two countries are motivated by a historical revanchism makes them all the likelier to initiate conflict in the near future if they believe that the costs will not be too high. At first glance, the cost has not been worth it. Putin believed Ukraine would fall without too great an effort, so he launched his invasion. He did not get the short victory he envisioned and has paid dearly in men and material. It's unclear what an acceptable victory even looks like for Russia at this point, despite the slow advances it's made in 2024. But only Putin has the most important piece of information, whether all of the losses Russia has suffered in the war and the economic isolation from most of the world's advanced economies has all been worth it. He is the only one with that information because as a dictator, he is the only one that can make the decisions. If Putin believes that the war in Ukraine has been worth it despite the losses, the Baltic states are in much greater danger. Russia already has annexation plans involving Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Documents leaked to Swedish media in 2023 revealed a multi-stage approach. First, the Kremlin seeks to change attitudes toward NATO in the Baltic states. Through the influence of NGOs and the cultivation of relationships with friendly politicians, it hopes to promote closer cooperation with Russia and stop the Baltic states from leaving the post-Soviet power grid. By 2030, Moscow hopes that the Baltic states will view NATO as a danger to their national security. These documents were drawn up in 2021, before the invasion of Ukraine, and it's likely that their authors in the Directorate for Interregional Relations and Cultural Contacts did not know that their leader was planning to invade Ukraine. The plan's already unlikely prospect of coming to fruition is all but impossible now. With peaceful annexation, or at least reincorporation into the Russian sphere of influence off the table, will Moscow resort to grey zone operations or even all-out war to bring the Baltic states back into its orbit, as it did in Ukraine? Unlike Ukraine, the Baltic states are all under Article 5 protection from the North Atlantic Treaty. This acts as a powerful deterrent, and the entrance of Sweden into NATO has helped to relieve some of the security pressures on Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Before Sweden arrived, an attack on the Suwalki Gap would have left these three NATO members completely cut off from their allies. Thanks to Sweden, though, there is now a direct sea route to keep the Baltic states supplied, even if the land connection with Poland is cut. Supplies and reinforcements could be gathered in Swedish territory and sent to the Baltic states. This would increase the costs incurred on the invading Russian forces and slow their momentum as they tried to take territory. The presence of Sweden and its Gripen fighters and submarines also adds more intelligence to NATO's arsenal, reducing Russia's prospects for surprise even further. Nevertheless, Russia would inevitably have a numerical advantage on this front, and we have seen in Ukraine how much this has mattered. The line would be narrower too, and the Russian military has absorbed many of the lessons on modern warfare it has been taught the hard way by its Ukrainian foe, such as the importance of drones and precision-guided artillery fire. More recently, Russia has adapted to the demands of modern trench warfare by using lighter vehicles like pickup trucks, all-terrain vehicles, and even motorcycles to ferry troops while transporting supplies by golf carts. These vehicles are the linchpin for smaller units using mobile tactics, often night raids, and often come armed with small artillery guns or anti-tank guided missiles. Some of the vehicles can carry loads of up to 3 tons, but they still have cruising speeds of almost 100 miles per hour. This is important because while Ukrainian FPV drones have cost Russia dearly in its traditional military vehicles, these small, often unarmored vehicles are much harder for those drones to target. The Ukrainians had once pioneered these light unit anti-drone tactics, but the Russians have learned from their enemies. These modern stormtrooper-style tactics have been one of the keys to Russia's slow but steady advances across previously unassailable land in 2024. They have had some success in breaking through the screen of Ukrainian FPV drones. The success of these tactics might act as a further enticement for Russia to view an invasion of the Baltic states as a more realistic possibility. Their much smaller territorial extent than Ukraine make them much more ideal for a fast takeover. And if Moscow thinks it has learned enough lessons to overcome Western tactics and equipment, the chance for an invasion of the Baltic states increases. The only thing stopping this more aggressive Russia from invading the Baltic states is their alignment with NATO. When interviewed by Politico in the summer of 2022, the people of Lithuania expressed a high degree of confidence that their NATO allies would come to their defense in the event of an attack on the Suwalki Gap. However, security experts have noted that the invocation of Article 5 for something as otherwise insignificant as the Suwalki Gap remains untested. In theory, the North Atlantic Treaty obligates all members to come to the defense of an ally under attack, no matter how small. However, as NATO grew larger, some national security experts wondered whether the expansion would expose its older members to vulnerabilities it would not in practice want to mobilize force for. Would countries like the United States or Turkey come to the defense of small and faraway countries like the Baltic states if they were attacked? In the case of Lithuania, for example, would the other members of NATO want to risk a wider war and maybe even a nuclear confrontation for the sake of a largely uninhabited stretch of land along a remote 62-mile border? The American public, for example, is war-weary, and aid to Ukraine has proven controversial in its divided politics. Would the public accept a deployment to Eastern Europe to defend this seemingly inconsequential part of the world? This question is not a mere abstraction. China has already proven the concept in the South China Sea when it seized control of the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. This piece of real estate falls under the Philippines' exclusive economic zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China, however, gambled that the Philippines would not use military force to defend it, much less any of its allies. It has done the same with its expansion into the rest of the South China Sea, ultimately betting correctly that no one would raise too serious a challenge to defend the international status quo. A court finding in 2016 invalidated all of China's claims, but it has ignored the ruling. Russia has watched the progress of its strategic partner carefully, while increased aggression against the Baltic states as it remains at war with Ukraine seem out of the question. What will happen when the conflict concludes? If Russia walks away with more substantial gains than expected, would Western leaders be willing to use military force to defend the Baltic states in the face of grey zone and salami-slicing operations, or even an outright annexation, as Russia has reportedly planned? What do you think? Is this small part of northeastern Europe one of the likeliest places for World War III to start? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how war in Ukraine is de-Russifying Baltic states, or click this other video instead. From the moment the invasion began, the Russo-Ukrainian war has been filled with twists and turns. At first, Russia and its president Vladimir Putin believed Ukraine would crumble in no more than a week. However, Ukraine displayed indomitable spirit and turned this would-be swift conquest into an unpredictable battle lasting over 2 years. What's more, with the help of Western allies, Ukraine has made Russia look inferior, struggling to maintain its grip in the face of relentless defiance. But just as Russia was practically written off by the West, the country managed to bounce back almost miraculously, replenishing its troops and military equipment. So now a freshly invigorated Russia is on the offensive, and Ukraine is running out of weapons, and the necessary aid is just not coming. It's no wonder Europe is already preparing for a potential Russian victory. Though numerous scenarios concerning Europe's fate have been floated around, they all share the same premise. Putin isn't just going to stop at Ukraine. If he does win the war, all of Europe will be at his mercy. However, he can't just launch a war against an entire continent, though to be fair, that does seem like something he might try, given his dangerous delusions and imperial ambitions. No, if he does invade Europe, he'll likely start closer to home, targeting countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. The countries in question are the so-called Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But although these countries were once under Soviet control, they're now independent states and, more importantly, members of an alliance that isn't too fond of Russia's antics: NATO. And remember, an attack against one NATO member is considered an attack against all. If Putin is foolish enough to attack the Baltic states, he likely won't face just a few small nations, more like a united front of some of the world's most powerful militaries. But let's face it, Putin was foolish enough to attack Ukraine, so who's to say he won't try his luck against NATO too? Plus, there are ways to subdue a country without a direct military attack, and Russia is well acquainted with these tactics. With this in mind, let's see what a Russian victory in the Russo-Ukrainian War would mean for Europe and the rest of the world. One thing's for certain, things are going to get ugly. But how did we even get here? Didn't Western military experts proclaim that Putin is down and out? They absolutely did, and for good reason. No one could have predicted how fast Russia would recuperate. Even US intelligence officials were certain it would take Russia at least a decade to fully recover from the losses suffered on the Ukrainian battlefield. Yet somehow Russia managed to do so in a matter of months. Though to be fair, the country's military capabilities are nowhere near fully restored, but they aren't fully crushed either. What's making this dire situation even more worrisome is the fact that the US is withholding military aid to Ukraine. But why? After all, the US has been Ukraine's staunchest supporter throughout the conflict, spending roughly $175 billion on military aid. The current holdup seemingly has to do with an assumption that the war in Ukraine will remain a stalemate regardless of what the US does. However, the situation on the battlefield clearly suggests otherwise. Russia has been taking full advantage of the missing aid to break out of positional warfare and launch more aggressive offensives. Its aircraft are dropping bombs left and right as Ukraine's air defense dwindles, and Russian troops are pushing deeper into Ukrainian territory, seizing roughly 140 square miles of territory in 2024 alone. That's not to mention that Russia is poised to overshoot Ukraine 10-1 very soon. And all because Ukraine has virtually no means to defend itself. It needs more air defense systems, artillery, and munitions. More. If these don't arrive on time, Russia will likely emerge victorious as early as 2025. But what does a Russian victory even entail? Despite a popular misconception, Kyiv doesn't have to fall for Russia to win in Ukraine. Russia can win in a much more non-violent way. All it takes is for Ukraine to call for a ceasefire, as the country runs out of forces and firepower, and all the cards would be handed to Russia. The country would likely use this opportunity to request a new Ukrainian regime, expel NATO, destroy Ukrainian weaponry, and seize parts of the country. In other words, Russia would tear Ukraine apart piece by piece until there's nothing left but a demilitarized puppet state. But regardless of how Russia achieves victory in Ukraine, one thing's for sure: that victory would cost Europe dearly. So let's dive into this worst-case scenario. Let's see what will happen if Russia wins the war in Ukraine. There's no doubt about it, Ukraine will be hit the hardest. Well, at least at first. There would likely be a massive exodus of people fleeing the country to escape Russian control. We're talking millions of people and a potential refugee crisis in Europe and beyond. After all, staying in the country likely means facing horrifying violence and human rights abuses, even perhaps large-scale civilian killings. Basically, Russia wants to fully absorb Ukraine and is willing to eradicate the Ukrainians who don't comply. But if the Russian invasion of Ukraine taught us anything, it's that Ukrainians won't go down without a fight. There will likely be a massive Ukrainian insurgency fighting against Russian occupation. But the bad news is that Russia knows this too. That's why the country is already preparing specialized military units to handle such an insurgency. In other words, Ukrainians likely don't stand a chance. But what about the rest of Europe? As mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Baltic states would likely be Putin's next target, with the rest of Eastern Europe being on high alert, and for good reason. Prior to the invasion, Ukraine acted as a buffer between Russia and this part of Europe. But if Ukraine falls, there's nothing standing in Putin's way. Well, except for NATO, but we'll get to that later. For now, let's focus on Russia and how it might deploy its troops after a victory in Ukraine. First things first, a victory in Ukraine would bring about a much larger and significantly more dangerous Russian military. The country is already conscripting men en masse, including those in occupied Ukrainian regions. These new conscripts are neither adequately trained nor treated as humans, as they're often sent to die in brutal human wave offensives. The fall of Ukraine into Russia's hands would lead to an influx of these ill-fated conscripts, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians will be forced to join the Russian military. Throw spending over 7% of GDP on the military into the mix and it becomes clear Russia's in it for the long haul. It's essentially adapted its entire economy and society to sustain war efforts. From how Russia is positioning its growing troops, it becomes evident which country of the Baltic Three might be targeted first: Estonia. Russia has already published plans to establish a new Northwest Army Corps dangerously close to this country. This is a stark contrast to the pre-invasion situation, as Russia used to have only one airborne division and mechanized infantry brigade near the Estonian border. In other words, Estonia faced no serious conventional military threat from Russia, much like the rest of Eastern Europe. If Ukraine falls, this will surely change. Russia will be able to bring much of the forces previously tied up in Ukraine to Estonian borders. But for some reason, Western military experts keep dismissing this possibility. They believe that Russia will only move two newly created armies to the borders of Estonia and other Baltic countries, the one deployed in Crimea and the one deployed on the eastern borders of Ukraine and Belarus. As for the rest of the Russian troops, they're estimated to return to their previous bases within the Russian boundaries. But these bases are no way adequate for Russia's strategic goals, so the country is more likely to establish new bases that bring it closer to the Baltic states and, in turn, NATO. But where could Russia launch an attack against Estonia from precisely? Well, there's a city in northeastern Estonia practically overflowing with ethnic Russian population. This city is even connected to Russia through a bridge symbolically named the Friendship Bridge. Russia could use this bridge, and the friendship promise it holds, to come to the rescue of the Russian nationals living in Narva. But why would Russians need any help in Narva? The simple answer is they wouldn't. This is just a tactic Russia might employ to try and seize the Baltic countries without a NATO intervention. The process is simple: cause internal strife in the country, storm in under the guise of protecting the local population, and that's it. NATO might have issues deciding whether or not to intervene, as the conflict would be perceived as an internal struggle. If this strategy fails, Russia could threaten a short-notice mechanized offensive against Estonia, with at least 8 divisions, backed by reserves from the 1st Guards Tank Army, which was always meant to be the primary offensive unit against NATO. That's not to mention that Russian ground troops would be covered by an extensive air defense network consisting of S-300, S-400, and S-500 anti-missile systems. So now we're talking about a more direct attack. Wouldn't this trigger Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty? There's no doubt about it, it would. But just because NATO is obliged to defend its member state doesn't mean the alliance will have an easy time doing so. In fact, NATO would definitely not be able to defend Estonia against a short-term attack with the forces it currently has in Europe. As a result, the US would have to deploy a sizable portion of its ground forces to the Baltic region and the entire NATO eastern border. The same goes for the US's fleet of stealth aircraft, which would likely have to be permanently moved to Europe. These aircraft will be used to annihilate Russian air defense systems, thus preventing Russia from sending non-stealthy aircraft and missiles to wreak havoc across Estonia. And these aircraft will be successful, there's no question about it. But at what cost? Committing a substantial stealth aircraft fleet to Europe means taking away from Taiwan. This in turn means that the US wouldn't be able to successfully protect Taiwan against a potential Chinese invasion. And a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is very likely to happen if Russia wins in Ukraine. In fact, experts believe that Putin's success would encourage more countries than just China to invade a neighbor. Venezuela and Azerbaijan also top the list. This means that Russia's victory would likely trigger a domino effect of global conflicts, reshaping the world order as we know it. But for now, let's stick to Europe. As mentioned, Estonia wouldn't be the only country on the receiving end of Russian aggression. After all, Putin and other Russian nationalists have been quite public and clear about one thing. The status of all the NATO member Baltic states that have previously been part of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire is far from settled in their eyes. As Russia sees it, these states rightfully belong under Russian control. Besides being geographically close and historically linked, the Baltic states also have a notable number of ethnic Russian population. Estonia, Russia's first target, has about 22.5% ethnic Russians, which is around 375,000 people. In Narva, for instance, this figure reaches a staggering 87.7%, which is what makes the city perfect as a starting point for a large-scale invasion. The total percentage is even higher in Latvia, potentially Russia's next target, with 25% or 445,000 ethnic Russians living in the country. Lithuania only has 5% ethnic Russians, around 145,000 people, but this will in no way deter Russia from using similar tactics to justify an intervention in the country. Since this is precisely what Russia has been doing, using the number of ethnic Russians living in these countries to justify any future actions aimed at asserting control over them. According to Putin, the fact that such a large number of ethnic Russians are living outside Russia is a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. That's rich coming from the guy orchestrating humanitarian atrocities on the daily, but we digress. Besides having a high number of ethnic Russians living in the country, Latvia seems to be high on Putin's list of targets due to some recent changes in immigration laws. Unfortunately, this massive Russian minority also makes Latvia the weakest link in the Baltic chain. Given that there are still some Latvian parties striving for closer ties with Russia, Putin might not take a violent route with Latvia, well, at least for now. The Kremlin might first try to incite resistance to the current Latvian government and subdue the country from within. Staging an uprising in communities with a Russian majority, such as the Latgale region, could also do the trick. If Russia manages to cause enough political unrest before the next elections scheduled for 2027, the country should have no issues swooping in with a swift but concentrated attack on Latvia, bringing the country under its control. The attack in question would be carried out with substantially superior forces, as Russia had learned from the mistakes it made when initially invading Ukraine. Lithuania, on the other hand, won't fall as easily. Even now, while Russia is still sticking to grey zone tactics, a difference in how Lithuania and Latvia act toward the country is more than evident. For instance, when Russia came out with an outrageous decree to revise its borders in the Baltic Sea to the detriment of the Baltic states, Latvia was focused on clarifying and rectifying the situation. Lithuania, in contrast, labeled this move as a deliberate, targeted escalatory provocation, sending a clear message to Russia: such actions won't be tolerated. But courageous statements aside, does Lithuania stand a chance against Russia? Numbers-wise, the answer is a resounding no. As of 2024, Russia has roughly 1.32 million active duty personnel, and the plan is for this number to reach 1.5 million in the foreseeable future, and then there's the 2 million reservists. Combine these two figures together and you get a number that's higher than the entire population of Lithuania. And at 2.8 million residents, Lithuania is the biggest country out of the Baltic Three. Of course, Russia wouldn't be able to wage an attack with its active duty force, nor would Lithuania only defend itself with its measly 23,000 active duty soldiers. But let's put this aside for a second and discuss how this attack might unfold geographically. At the moment, the biggest danger from Lithuania comes from the neighboring Kaliningrad, a Russian-run mini-state. This region has become increasingly militarized in recent years, housing systems like the Iskander mobile short-range ballistic missiles. For this reason, Kaliningrad could become a launching pad for an attack on Lithuania. Some military experts even believe that Lithuania might be the first Russian target after Ukraine due to the sheer proximity of Kaliningrad, as well as its military divisions and capabilities. Once again, NATO would have a pretty hard time defending the country. This especially applies if former US President Donald Trump is re-elected in 2024. Trump has continuously criticized NATO over the years and repeatedly promised to weaken US's commitment to NATO if re-elected. If this happens, Lithuania might become low-hanging fruit for Russia. The same goes for the rest of Eastern Europe. How so? Well, Russia is likely to take advantage of any perceived NATO weakness to send in special forces in unmarked uniforms, the so-called Little Green Men, to set up roadblocks at the Suwalki Gap. the narrow strip of land between Kaliningrad and Belarus, which connects Lithuania to Poland. A similar strategy was used in Crimea in 2014, a peninsula that was later used as a springboard for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. If the Suwalki Gap falls under Russian control, Russia has a clear path toward Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe. Poland, Slovakia, and Romania are often quoted as the countries Putin might go after next. Plus, capturing the Suwalki Gap would effectively cut off the Baltic states from the rest of NATO, making it easier to keep them under control. Considering what's at stake, Russia would have to prepare and conduct this attack fast enough to avoid leaving any time for NATO to introduce large reinforcements from France, Germany, and the US. For this reason, the bulk of Russian forces needed to secure the Suwalki Gap would likely be brought in from the newly re-established Leningrad and Moscow military districts, as these forces can move to attack positions much more rapidly and stealthily. But even if NATO countries become aware of this takeover, would they react? Sure, Poland, the Baltic states, and the Scandinavian countries would likely call for drastic measures and tough actions. However, the US would probably only be able to provide logistical support, while Germany and France might hold back altogether, fearing that Russia might set its sights on Western Europe next. Of course, there's also the ever-looming threat of nuclear weapons entering the conflict. It goes without saying that this will be a nightmare scenario with only one possible outcome: an apocalypse of unimaginable horror. This worst-case scenario is probably the #1 reason Russia would be allowed to carry on with its antics once it reached the Suwalki Gap. All things considered, it's abundantly clear that things can't be allowed to go this far. NATO must turn the tide before it's too late. After all, the alliance is far superior to Russia in terms of military power and technology, and can't allow Russia to bully its way into reshaping the world order. So what's being done to prevent this from happening? Since US aid is still up in the air, the focus has been shifted to deterrence. The Baltic states know they're next in line if Ukraine falls. Worst of all, they won't face a weakened Russia, but one emboldened by its success in Ukraine. A country that believes it's defeated a unified Western front all alone, a frightening prospect indeed. That's why Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have started creating massive border defenses, but these moves aren't exactly new. Ever since Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, the Baltic states have been ringing the alarm about the potentially disastrous consequences of this move. Unfortunately, no one seems to have been listening back then. But this didn't stop the Baltic states from taking proactive measures. One of the most significant was increasing their military budget to 3% of their GDP. This increased budget will partly be used for the border defenses we just mentioned. The so-called Baltic Defense Zone will be set up on the borders with Russia and Belarus, a country that's been increasingly cozying up to Russia. This zone will primarily consist of physical defensive structures like bunkers. Estonia alone plans to begin the construction of roughly 600 bunkers in early 2025. Besides these shared defenses, the Baltic states have also been working on strengthening their troops. To this end, Latvia reintroduced conscription in 2023 after stopping mandatory military service in 2006, the only Baltic country to do so. Estonia, for its part, has managed to double its defense force to 20,000 people, while Latvia has the same ambitions. For the latter country, the goal is to double the armed forces to about 60,000 soldiers by 2032. As for Lithuania, the country made a deal with Germany, which would bring 4,800 troops to the country by 2027 to defend its territory against Russia. The Baltic states have also been taking steps to fortify the area surrounding the two major flashpoints in a potential conflict, Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Gap. However, since deterrence doesn't always work with Russia, the Baltic states and the rest of Eastern Europe have also been devising new battle plans, as Hanno Pevkur, Estonian Minister of Defense, puts it. Of course, he didn't share any details, but it's clear that the Baltic states are taking the Russian threat more than seriously. Though this is by no means surprising. It's a standard practice to prepare security policies for what might happen. What has changed, however, is the views on Russia's territorial aims and its readiness to use ruthless force. This change has significantly impacted how NATO and its allies strategize. But even while Ukraine still stands, the Baltic states aren't free from Russian attacks. The only difference is that these attacks are more sly, representing the so-called hybrid warfare strategy. Here are just some of the hybrid warfare tactics Russia has used so far. Russia tried to recruit Estonian citizens to attack their own government. It's been actively trying to create a crisis on the borders of the Baltic countries by sending waves of migrants towards them. It's used hacking, leaking, and similar disinformation campaigns to destabilize the political landscape. Basically, Russia's goal was to promote general insecurity in the Baltic region before moving on to more decisive and aggressive actions. All things considered, we're left with three possible scenarios if Russia wins in Ukraine. Scenario 1. The Baltic states fall under Russian control. In this scenario, Russia continues its aggressive expansion into Europe, fueled by Putin's dreams of a new Russian empire. NATO's response is hampered by internal divisions and a fear of escalating the conflict into a full-blown war. As a result, the Baltic states are overwhelmed relatively quickly, creating a new sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and opening the doors to further Russian advances into neighboring countries. Scenario number 2. A prolonged stalemate. In this scenario, NATO and the Baltic states do everything in their power to avoid a conflict altogether. This includes continuing to increase NATO's military presence and support in the Baltic region, as well as the country's individual defenses. This scenario will likely lead to a prolonged standoff, with both sides engaging in periodic skirmishes and hybrid warfare tactics. Though an all-out war will be avoided, this scenario also turns the Baltic region into a highly militarized zone, with an ever-looming threat of escalation. And scenario number 3. NATO successfully deters further aggression. With Europe's security at stake, NATO has no choice but to find a way to appropriately respond to the Russian threat and deter any further military action. This scenario can only work if the alliance continues to receive the necessary support from the US, which would in turn rally the rest of NATO members to display a united front and take decisive action against Russia. In this scenario, Russia would be forced to either reconsider its expansionist ambitions or face overwhelming resistance and likely its downfall. So what do you think? Which of these scenarios seems most likely? Or is there a fourth scenario that you see taking place if Russia is to win in Ukraine? Share your theories in the comments section below. In February 2022, Russia's President Vladimir Putin made a decision that shocked the global community. He invaded Ukraine. That war was meant to be a smash-and-grab operation, with Russia rolling in on tanks to secure Kyiv before establishing its rule in Ukraine as a whole. And it almost worked. Russian forces managed to enter Kyiv, albeit briefly, before resistance fighters pushed them back. Then that resistance started gathering steam. Most of the Western world supported Ukraine financially and provided military equipment, giving Kyiv the ability to fight back against Putin's aggression. To date, Western nations have pledged and provided over $380 billion in aid to Ukraine, with more on the way. This wasn't what Putin wanted. What was supposed to be an easy victory has devolved into a multi-year war that looks unlikely to end anytime soon. And yet, rather than withdrawing from Ukraine and accepting that it isn't going to achieve the easy victory it anticipated, Russia keeps pushing forward with the fight. But why? Putin's arrogance. That will be the focus of this video, as we explore how Putin's arrogance has led him into a no-win situation in Ukraine, and how, terrifyingly for the Russian public, Putin's ambition could be the death of his country. But before we dig into how Putin's arrogance will destroy Russia, we need to learn a little bit more about the man. Specifically, what drove him to invade Ukraine in the first place. Whenever he speaks publicly, Putin offers hints to one of the main reasons he invaded Ukraine. He is, if nothing else, a patriot, and he longs for the days when Russia was one of the world's most powerful countries. Putin wants to restore the glory days of the Soviet Union, ignoring all of the internal strife that period caused in his country, and wishes to restore Russia's dominance over the rest of Europe. We can see snippets of this agenda coming through in Putin's February 2024 interview with Tucker Carlson. In this interview, Putin tries to position himself less as an aggressor to the Ukrainian people and more as a savior to not only the country but the rest of Europe. Specifically, he claims that the denazification of Ukraine was one of his main goals with the war, with Putin telling Carlson, "We haven't achieved our aims yet because one of them is denazification." A seemingly noble cause. However, in one of the few times when Carlson pressed an issue in that interview, Putin was later asked if he would be satisfied with the territory he has now if he wins in Ukraine. Putin didn't respond to that question, instead returning to his point of denazifying Ukraine. The takeaway? Putin wouldn't be satisfied with just claiming Ukraine. He wants to restore Russia to its former glory. Other parts of that interview deliver a more direct through-line into his thinking. At various points, Putin engages in long and rambling diatribes, which he dresses up as history lessons, talking about how Russia and Europe were in the past. Though long-winded, these discussions reveal that Putin still sees Europe in old terms, with part of his justification for invading Ukraine seemingly boiling down to it was part of Russia before, and so it should be part of Russia now. To anybody who'd been paying attention to Putin's rhetoric when the war started, this was nothing new. In February 2024, the same month Russia invaded Ukraine, The Guardian reported on an hour-long speech Putin gave, in which he delivered his version of the history of Ukraine. Notable snippets from that interview include Putin claiming, "Ukraine is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space," as well as claiming the Bolsheviks made a massive mistake when they recognized Ukraine as a republic. The claims on land kept coming, when he also discussed how ceding territory as part of ending World War I was another mistake, along with lamentations of the loss of territory of the former Russian Empire. By this point, Putin's agenda seems clear. He wants a return to the old Russia. And to some, that may not be a sign of arrogance. It's natural for a patriot to want to see his country reclaim the glory days and take its position as a leader on the global stage. However, Putin's desire to restore Russia isn't driven by his love of country. It's driven by revenge and a desire for personal power. After all, Putin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine is far from the first time that he's tried to control the country. It's just the most direct military attempt. He's made several tries at establishing Russian dominance in Ukraine over the past 2 decades. Take Ukraine's 2004 presidential election as an example. That election saw Putin's first real attempt to create what he calls managed democracy, a term the Carnegie Endowment for Peace says Putin uses to describe the type of regime he wants to create. In short, Putin doesn't want full democracy. He wants a shadow version, in which elections are held, but they're so lopsided toward his agenda that they may as well not exist. To that end, he poured all of his efforts into helping Ukraine's then Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, secure the country's presidency. He failed. Despite spending an enormous amount of money on Yanukovych's campaign, as well as attempting to hinder the rest of the world's understanding of the election result, Putin couldn't get his puppet into office. Allegations of voter fraud abounded, with outgoing President Leonid Kuchma told that he had to dismiss the Central Election Commission's chairman by Charles Tannock, the European Parliament's delegation for Ukraine. Tannock said the chairman had clearly not been above board, going on to cite figures that suggested several parts of the country had seen voter turnouts of more than 100%. He added that absentee ballot abuse, ballot stuffing, and even intimidation of voters had taken place. Putin even campaigned on behalf of his preferred candidate, only to see tens of thousands of Yanukovych's opponent's supporters line the streets of Kyiv to protest the official tally that had placed Yanukovych 3 points ahead. That opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, eventually received the backing of most of the Ukrainian parliament. The country's Supreme Court ended up annulling the election result, with Yushchenko coming out on top in a fairer vote several weeks later. Putin ended up shooting himself in the foot. By so radically backing Yanukovych to the point that he tried to pull off election fraud, Putin ended up with a president in Ukraine that he didn't want, and one who wouldn't be open to conciliatory talks with Russia. With his political maneuvering in tatters, Putin instead tried to rely on the KGB to get rid of Ukraine's president. Putin has been accused of attempting to assassinate Yushchenko soon after he took office, with that attempt failing as spectacularly as his attempt to influence the 2004 election in Ukraine. Putin was humiliated. In particular, his ego took a massive shot as the pride he felt as an astute political leader who could effortlessly influence policies in other countries was proven to be false. His efforts had blown up in his face, and he wasn't going to take the humiliation lying down. Though Putin veered away from trying to kill Yushchenko after his first assassination attempt ended, he still tried to have an impact on Ukraine's stability. We see this from multiple gas crises in Ukraine experienced as a result of Russian actions in 2006 and 2009. Both years saw Russia cut gas supplies off, supposedly due to disputes about pricing, with the effects of those cutoffs reverberating far beyond Ukraine. Russia has also spent the last 20 years building pipelines that allow it to circumvent Ukraine, this time creating a situation in which it could cut the country off while still maintaining relationships with other nations. You could argue that this attempt to scuttle Ukraine had a greater impact. A year after the second cutoff, Putin finally got his man, Viktor Yanukovych, in office. Between 2010 and 2014, Yanukovych reigned as president and immediately began making changes to the constitution. Putin had what he wanted, at least for a short time. But then the Euromaidan protests came in 2013 as a direct response to Yanukovych's refusal to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. Instead, Ukraine's president ignored the country's parliament, which had voted overwhelmingly to approve the deal, and instead chose to create another trade agreement with Russia. As they did following the results of the 2004 election, Ukrainians took to the streets. Violent clashes between protesters and Ukrainian state forces resulted, with Yanukovych ultimately being run out of Ukraine. The country's parliament chose to remove him with a vote of 380 to 0, and Ukraine restored its constitution to what it had been in 2004. Putin had once again lost influence. Russian media cries of a coup fell on deaf ears. However, the protests and ousting of Yanukovych did open the door for Putin to annex Crimea, taking control of the territory away from Ukraine. This was the first sign of the lengths Putin was willing to go to in order to take the entire country. But by this point, he was likely no longer as fueled by a desire to reclaim the former Russia as he had been in the past. He had a personal agenda. Ukraine had humiliated him multiple times. It had gotten rid of the leader he wanted in power twice and survived even when he cut off gas supplies. Even the annexation of Crimea wasn't the victory Putin was hoping for. Ukraine still carried on, building stronger ties with the West as Putin saw the country slipping further and further out of his grip. His ego couldn't take it. And in his arrogance, Putin decided that he could take Ukraine easier by force rather than accepting the country as an independent state over which he had no real control. In this context, we can start to see the war in a different light. While Putin outwardly claims the war is about denazification and the restoration of the old Russia, internally there's a clear element of personal vendetta at play. Ukraine spent nearly 20 years deflecting Putin's influence, political, economic, and even military, showing Putin to be far less powerful as a political player than he believed himself to be. And that leads us to the third reason why Putin launched his war in Ukraine. Personal power may mean more to him than Russian dominance. Putin became Russia's president in December 1999, following a surprise address delivered by former President Boris Yeltsin. It was a rapid rise to power for a man who had only been appointed as Russia's prime minister 4 months previously. And in May 2000, Putin was inaugurated for his first full 4-year term after just scraping through an election with 53% of the nation's vote. No Russian election has been as close ever since. Putin won with 71.9% of the vote in 2004, with the next election taking place 8 years later, despite Russia supposedly having 4-year terms. That one was a little closer, with Putin taking 63.6% of the vote, though his nearest competitor, Gennady Zyuganov, only racked up 17.8%. 6 years later, Putin won another election, this time with 76.69% of the vote, with the most recent 2024 election seeing him take 87.29%. This is Putin's managed democracy in action, a system where he appears to compete with other candidates in elections that some accuse of being rigged. Putin has now tallied 24 years as the president of Russia, with no end in sight, and he'll likely try to maintain that position for the rest of his life. But what's interesting here isn't necessarily the possible rigging of elections over the last 24 years. Rather, Putin has also used war on multiple occasions to justify his position as Russia's leader. Open Democracy notes one theory that suggests the second Chechen campaign of 1999 helped Putin achieve his rapid political ascent. From previously being a relative unknown in Russian politics, he rose to become the president less than a year after that campaign, gaining a ton of popular support in the process. While the organization claims that theory likely isn't correct based on opinion polls at the time, Putin himself may believe that being seen as a strong wartime leader helped him to take the reins of power. Later wars, such as his Georgia campaign of 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, may have been less about claiming territory for Russia as they were creating a situation in which Putin could be seen as a strong leader. Sow some seeds of chaos and encourage the people to back their current leader ahead of anyone who might challenge him. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has led him to believe that he is the only leader that Russia can rely on. He does everything he can to maintain power, with his 2022 invasion of Ukraine possibly being the latest attempt by him to stir up national pride so he keeps himself where he wants to be. And it appears to have worked, at least if you believe Russia's 2024 election results are legitimate. By this point, it's clear that Putin's arrogance is fueled by a combination of his desire to return Russia to its former glory and a need to be seen as the man who did it, a personal vendetta against Ukraine, and his thirst for power. But what Putin doesn't realize is that very arrogance may have placed Russia on the edge of destruction. Let's start explaining why by taking a closer look at the impact the Ukraine war has had on Putin and Russia as a whole. Putin's initial invasion was far from successful. Though Russian troops managed to enter Kyiv, they were repelled in what AP News calls a defeat for the ages. Russia also suffered tremendous losses to its Black Sea fleet and may have lost as many as 342 planes and 325 helicopters, if reports from Ukraine are accurate. Its personnel losses are at least 85,000, with Ukraine claiming they're much higher, which has forced Russia to engage in a war of attrition in which it attempts to wear Ukraine down. That alone has been damaging to Russia. Though the world still views Russia as a strong military power, it's no longer seen as one that can roll over a country that's meant to be substantially weaker than it. Granted, Russia would likely have won in Ukraine already were it not for the international aid that has propped up Kyiv almost since the war began. But Putin's arrogance, in assuming he could take Ukraine in a matter of weeks, has instead revealed Russia's military to be outdated and too reliant on numbers rather than modern equipment and sound strategy. In other words, a stronger country than Ukraine might now feel more confident in its chances of winning a war against Russia in the future. And that's especially the case after they've seen Russia lose so much of its modern equipment, forcing it to repurpose old Soviet hardware to keep its war machine churning. It gets worse for Russia. Whether it wins or loses the war in Ukraine, the country as a whole is going to feel the negative effects for years to come. A loss would likely result in it being stuck with the bill for rebuilding a country it has spent 2 years destroying, as well as Russia having to deal with being a less capable player on the geopolitical stage. It would also likely have to deal with long-running sanctions in the aftermath of a loss, such as a potential extension of the $60 per barrel cap currently in place on Russian oil. Then there's the continuation of other sanctions that have lowered the country's economic gross domestic product, forecast by 7% compared to pre-war estimates. And if Putin wins his war, he'll face the exact same problems. Those who oppose him and Russian aggression as a whole will keep sanctions in place, potentially for years to come. He'll also still need to spend big on rebuilding Ukraine. After all, he claims that it should be part of Russia, and he'll want it to be a functioning part, rather than a ghost country that can offer little more than shelled-out buildings. Worse yet for Putin, his rebuilding efforts would likely have to be done under the shadow of continuous Ukrainian resistance, meaning it will likely cost more to rebuild Ukraine if he wins than it would if he loses. Economically, Russia may not be able to survive, no matter the results of Putin's war. That may seem like a strange claim on the surface. The International Monetary Fund expects Russia's economy to grow 3.2% in 2024, which is a full 2 percentage points higher than the UK, and nearly the same amount higher than the EU. Its budget deficit is also much lower than both, tracking at 1% of GDP compared to the UK's 5.1% and the EU's 2.8%. All signs of a thriving economy, right? However, these figures hide the fact that Russia's economy is far from diverse. It relies heavily on exporting oil and gas, with so much of its recent economic growth stemming from the fact that it's able to charge so heavily for both as a result of the war that Putin started. So what happens when the war ends? Russia will be forced to pull those prices back down if it wants to continue selling its main exports, which is when the country will have to wake up to the economic issues that Putin's arrogance has caused. Take how he's spending the country's national budget. Russia is dedicating around 40% of that budget to the wartime effort, with total military spending reaching about 5.9% of GDP in 2023. That money is going toward paying soldiers, building tanks and planes, compensating the families of dead soldiers, and buying equipment from other countries that it can use to fund its war. When the war ends, that entire economic crutch crumbles. The thousands who currently have jobs in Russian factories building military equipment will find themselves out of work. Russia itself will see that it has very little left over in the national budget, and as a result of victory, the country would find itself increasingly isolated from the global community, and the West in particular, leaving it reliant on countries like China to prop it up. Speaking of China, Putin also doesn't realize just how much control Beijing has over Russia's fate. Take oil as an example. With the rest of Europe drastically reducing how much oil it buys from Russia in the wake of Putin's war, now only accounting for 4.5% of purchases, Russia is increasingly relying on China and India to purchase its products. Together, those countries now account for 90% of Russia's crude oil exports, which is a clear example of a lack of diversification. China is the main buyer here, with Reuters pointing out that it now buys 50% of the oil that Russia produces. That's good news for Russia in the short term. It's able to keep bringing oil money in, even as Europe drops from buying 45% of its production to 4%. However, it also leaves the country in a position where it's increasingly reliant on China to fund its economy. That leads to the obvious question: what happens if China stops buying Russian oil? That may not be a far-flung question, given China's recent reaction to threats of sanctions being placed against it for doing business with Russia. Reuters reports that many of China's major banks are pulling back on financing transactions related to Russia, forcing companies to turn to small and less reliable banks, or in some cases cryptocurrency, to continue doing business. The news outlet quotes a banker at one of China's Big Four when talking about the reason. The main reason is to avoid unnecessary troubles. In other words, the banks don't want to be sanctioned, as that could affect Chinese trade globally. While this banking shutdown appears to be mostly related to consumer goods and similar types of businesses, it shows us what China is willing to do if it faces increasing international pressure. Who's to say that it wouldn't stop buying Russian oil or reduce the amount it's paying to meet the $60 cap Western nations have placed on the country's oil if it faced a significant amount of pressure? Either way, it's clear that Putin's arrogance has placed Russia in a no-win situation with China. If it continues relying on China to buy its gas and oil ahead of practically any other nation, it gives Beijing control over its purse strings. That could be a problem if China decides it wants to negotiate lower prices than Russia wants to charge, especially because Russia is quickly losing leverage that would allow it to keep prices high. And if China keeps pulling out of business dealings, as we're seeing as a result of the West's most recent sanction threats, Russia will realize that it's so dependent on China that it's little more than the country's junior partner. Not great for a man who wants to be seen as one of the leaders of the modern world. Certainly not a good outcome for a Russia that's already struggling to prop up an economy that's almost entirely dependent on war, oil, and gas. But Putin's actions haven't just harmed Russia's economy. They've also altered the global perception of the nation. We touched on this earlier when we pointed out that Putin's past failed attempts to control Ukraine ended in failure and exposed him as a less effective leader than he believes himself to be. And even though the world is rightfully wary of the threat Russia presents militaristically, it's also seeing a Russia that's struggling to defeat a much smaller country, albeit one that's being supported by the global community. Putin's arrogance has made Russia look weak, and he has also made himself look like a schoolyard bully. That's according to the Royal United Services Institute, which says that Putin's repeated threats of using tactical nukes in Ukraine are the sign of a man who's growing desperate. He wants Ukraine, the former Soviet territories, and the Western world at large to fear him. Instead, his actions are waking up many other countries to the threat that he presents as Russia's leader, which could, ironically, cause that threat to be limited. The reactions seen in the former Soviet states demonstrate that. In September 2022, Politico reported on the many losses of Russian influence across these states. For instance, Azerbaijan started shelling Armenia again during that month, breaking a ceasefire that Moscow had brokered. It was confident enough to do that because Putin pulled Russia's best troops out of the South Caucasus region, leaving the Russian-backed Armenia exposed. In Georgia, the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine is often flown in support of the embattled nation. Putin also saw himself snubbed by Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, who went as far as to claim his country doesn't recognize quasi-state territories, which, in our view, is what Luhansk and Donetsk are. Both are territories Russia currently controls in the war. The point here is that Putin is already struggling to control portions of his supposed empire, with a single war weakening his, and by extension, Russia's influence in these regions. Again, an example of how the Russian president's arrogance is actually weakening his country. Even more worrying are the reactions of the Western world to Putin's invasion. French President Emmanuel Macron has already claimed that NATO troops enter in Ukraine is a possibility. And even though the rest of NATO denies this, Macron hasn't backed down from his comments and even claimed as recently as May 2, 2024, that there's still a possibility that French troops could enter the country. Even the many NATO members who won't commit troops are still sending plenty of aid. The UK recently approved $620 million in aid, with the United States going 100 times bigger. It's approved $61 billion in April. The problem for Russia is that this shows Europe and the Western world at large is slowly waking up to Putin's ambitions. Many countries are now increasing their military budgets in response to Russia's invasion, ultimately meaning they will be able to put up a much stronger fight if Putin tries to coerce or cow them. Far from claiming Ukraine as a great victory for Russia, Putin has galvanized Europe to the point where it will now be much harder for him to achieve his ambitions of returning his country to its Soviet-era glory days. Instead, Russia will just face stronger sanctions, a dearth of clients for its gas and oil, and will have to confront the fact that its economy is now almost wholly reliant on a combination of war and Chinese money. And then there's the last potential nail in the coffin: the massive demographic damage done to Russia as a result of the war. Russians are leaving their home country at a rate of hundreds of thousands. The Economist says that the outbreak of war led to an exodus of 300,000 people, with the BBC saying that estimates for the numbers since range from the hundreds of thousands to several millions. That's all happening against the backdrop of an extended demographic crisis that Russia has experienced since the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet era, the country's birth rate halved due to the uncertainty its people had as a result of economic hardship. Raising those birth rates has been a cause close to Putin's heart since he took power, and he's failed every step of the way. Our World in Data says that Russia saw just 9.6 births for every 17 deaths in 2021. With the war in Ukraine killing so many of Russia's younger people, along with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more leaving, there may not be much of a Russia left by the time the war is over. All of this adds up to a country in crisis, one that, regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends, is in dire straits economically and in terms of geopolitical positioning. A Russia that's losing people at an alarming rate, and one that, as a result of Putin's arrogance and actions, could find itself playing second fiddle to China rather than rebuilding its empire in the coming years. But what do you think? Will Putin's arrogance truly lead to Russia's downfall? Or will victory in Ukraine give him the launching pad to rebuild what he believes the country has lost? How long would it take for Russia to rebuild in the wake of the war, especially if it loses? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Putin warns destruction of civilization is close, or click this other video instead.